This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was so excited for my solo camping trip to Trinity Alps. After quitting my job at a tech startup and ending a long-term relationship, I desperately needed some time alone to clear my head and figure out my next steps. The rugged wilderness of Northern California seemed like the perfect place to reconnect with myself and nature. Little did I know that my peaceful retreat would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. I arrived at the Canyon Creek Lakes trailhead on a crisp autumn morning, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation as I shouldered my heavy pack. The trail was challenging but beautiful, winding through towering pines and crystal-clear streams. By late afternoon, I had reached a secluded spot near one of the lakes and set up camp. That first evening was idyllic. I sat by my small campfire, sipping hot tea and watching the sunset paint the granite peaks in shades of gold and pink. The silence was profound. No traffic noise, no phone notifications, just the occasional cry of a distant bird. I felt the stress of the past few months starting to melt away. As night fell, I crawled into my tent and drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle lapping of the lake. A loud crack jolted me awake in the pitch darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my headlamp. The sound had been close, like a large branch snapping underfoot. I listened intently, but heard only silence. Probably just a deer, I told myself, trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Unable to fall back asleep, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The nearly full moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. That's when I noticed something odd about the tree closest to my tent. There was a strange symbol carved into the trunk that I hadn't seen earlier. It looked like a crude spiral. A chill ran down my spine. Had someone been in my campsite while I slept? I scanned the area with my headlamp, but saw no signs of anyone else. Eventually, I managed to doze off again, but my dreams were unsettling. Fleeting images of dark forests and shadowy figures. The next morning dawned bright and clear. In the cheerful sunlight, my fears from the night before seemed silly. I decided to spend the day hiking and exploring the area. As I walked, I noticed more of those spiral symbols carved into trees. They appeared old, the edges smoothed by weather and time. I wondered if they were trail markers of some kind, though I didn't remember seeing anything about them in my guidebook. By mid-afternoon, I was making my way back to camp when movement caught my eye. Through the trees, I glimpsed a figure walking parallel to my path, about 50 yards away. I raised my hand to wave, glad to see another hiker, but froze when I got a better look. It was a woman, but something about her was wrong. Her skin was impossibly pale, almost translucent. She moved with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural. When she turned her head in my direction, I saw that her eyes were completely black. No whites, no irises, just empty darkness. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. When I looked again, she was gone. My hands shook as I practically ran back to my campsite. I told myself I was just dehydrated, that the altitude was messing with my mind. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat up with my back against a tree, a heavy branch clutched in my hands like a weapon. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me flinch. Just before dawn, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer to my camp. I held my breath, willing whatever it was to pass by. The footsteps stopped right on the other side of my tent. I could see a shadow through the thin fabric. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was feminine but distorted, like multiple people speaking slightly out of sync. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with terror. The shadow moved away, and I heard the footsteps receding. As soon as I could move, I burst out of the tent, wild-eyed and gasping. The pale woman stood at the edge of the clearing, her black eyes boring into me. She raised one skeletal hand and pointed deeper into the forest. Then she simply faded away, like mist dissipating in sunlight. I'd love to say that I bravely stood my ground or tried to rationally explain what was happening. But the truth is, I panicked. I stuffed my sleeping bag and a few essentials into my pack and took off running down the trail. I hadn't gone far when I realized the forest itself seemed to be changing around me. Paths that should have been straight now twisted crazily. Trees loomed and shifted, their branches reaching for me like gnarled hands. And the whispers started. At first it was just unintelligible murmuring on the wind, but soon I could make out words, my name, pleas for help, angry hisses telling me to leave. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me. The witch, for I was certain now that's what she was, appeared and disappeared among the trees. Sometimes right in front of me, sometimes lurking just at the edge of my vision. Her mouth stretched in a grotesque smile, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. The whispering grew to a roar. The trees themselves seemed to be screaming now. I clapped my hands over my ears but couldn't block out the sound. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that nightmare chase. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst out of the tree line and found myself back at the trailhead parking lot. My RV sat there, a beautiful sight of normality and safety. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. As I peeled out of the lot, I caught one last glimpse in my rearview mirror. The witch, standing at the edge of the forest, raising her hand in what almost looked like a wave goodbye. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was well out of the mountains and back in familiar territory. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. It's been weeks now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat most nights. I see her face in my dreams, that gaunt, pale visage with those horrifying black eyes. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of her out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there. I've tried researching the history of Trinity Alps, looking for any folklore about witches or spirits. I've found a few vague references to an old woman of the woods in some local legends, but nothing substantial. Part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing, if the solitude and stress got to me and made me hallucinate. But then I'll find another spiral symbol carved into a tree in my neighborhood, or hear whispers on the wind that sound disturbingly familiar. I don't know what happened to me out there in those mountains. I don't know if I was chosen for some reason, or if I simply stumbled into something ancient and dangerous. But I do know that I'll never look at forests the same way again. There are things out there in the wilderness, old things, patient things, that are far beyond our understanding, and sometimes they don't stay in the wilderness. I'd been a travel blogger for years, always seeking out new adventures, but after Sarah died, I lost my passion for it all. Everything reminded me of her. We'd planned so many trips together, dreamed of seeing the world side by side. Now those dreams were shattered, and I was left alone with my memories and regrets. Eventually, I decided I needed to get away, to find some peace in solitude. Death Valley seemed like the perfect place, vast, empty, removed from the world. I packed up my gear and headed out to Racetrack Playa, eager to see the famous sailing stones that mysteriously move across the desert floor. The first couple days were uneventful. I set up camp, hiked around, took some photos. At night, I'd sit by my campfire, looking up at the star-filled sky and thinking about Sarah. It hurt, but in a way that felt necessary, like lancing a wound to let it heal. On the third day, things started to get weird. I was out exploring the playa when I noticed one of the sailing stones actually moving, not inching along slowly like they're supposed to, but sliding swiftly across the ground. I blinked, sure I was seeing things, but when I looked again it was still moving. I pulled out my camera, determined to capture this on video, but as soon as I started filming, the stone went still. Frustrated, I lowered the camera, and the stone immediately started moving again. This pattern repeated several times until I gave up and just watched in disbelief as the stone traced a perfect circle around me. That night, I heard singing on the wind, a haunting, melodic lullaby that sounded vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place it. The song seemed to be coming from all directions at once, surrounding me. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The next morning, I woke to find all the sailing stones arranged in a massive spiral pattern around my tent. There was no way that could have happened naturally. My skin crawled as I stared at the unnaturally perfect formation. What the hell was going on out here? That's when I saw her, a woman standing at the edge of the stone spiral, looking lost and confused. I approached cautiously, unsure if she was real or another hallucination. "Hello?" I called out. "Are you okay?" She turned to me, relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank God," she said. "I got so turned around out here. I've been wandering for hours." I introduced myself and learned her name was Lucy. She claimed she'd been hiking and gotten separated from her group. I offered her some water and invited her back to my camp to rest and call for help. As we walked, Lucy peppered me with questions about why I was out here alone. I found myself opening up, telling her about Sarah and my grief. She was a good listener, sympathetic and kind. For the first time in months, I felt a connection with another person. But as the day wore on, Lucy's behavior became increasingly odd. She'd stare off into space for long periods, then snap back to attention as if nothing had happened. Her questions got more personal, probing into painful memories of Sarah, and sometimes, just for a split second, I could swear her face seemed to shift and change. That night, I woke to the sound of that eerie lullaby again. I unzipped my tent and saw Lucy standing out in the playa, singing. The stones were moving around her, spinning in concentric circles. I blinked hard, sure I must be dreaming. When I looked again, everything was still. Lucy was gone. The next morning I confronted her about what I'd seen. She denied everything, looking at me with concern. "Mark, are you feeling all right?" she asked. "Maybe the heat is getting to you." I started to doubt my own sanity. Was I hallucinating, having some kind of grief-induced breakdown? But then Lucy's face suddenly contorted, stretching and shifting until she looked exactly like Sarah. My breath caught in my throat. "What's wrong, honey?" she said in Sarah's voice. "Don't you want me back?" I scrambled backwards, heart pounding. Lucy Sarah's face split into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Her eyes turned pitch black, like empty voids. "What are you?" I choked out. She cocked her head, still wearing Sarah's face. "I'm whatever you want me to be, Mark," she purred. "I can be your Sarah again. We can be together forever." I turned and ran. The ground beneath my feet began to shift and warp. The horizon swam in my vision. All around me, the sailing stones spun in dizzying spirals. That haunting lullaby filled the air, drowning out my panicked breathing. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, days, time lost all meaning. My legs ached, my lungs burned. Several times I collapsed, only to see Lucy Sarah's monstrous face looming over me, urging me to give in, to join her. Somehow I found the strength to keep going. Finally, mercifully, I spotted my car in the distance. With a last desperate burst of energy, I sprinted for it. I could hear Lucy right behind me, feel her hot breath on my neck. I dove into the car, fumbling with shaking hands to start the engine. As I peeled out, I caught one last glimpse of her in the rearview mirror, a writhing, shapeless mass of darkness. I didn't stop driving until I was hundreds of miles away. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I still don't. It's been months since that hellish week in Death Valley. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it was all just a hallucination brought on by grief and isolation. But I know deep down that it was real. Sometimes I still hear that lullaby on the wind, and the rocks in my garden keep arranging themselves in perfect spirals when I'm not looking. I shared my story on my blog, but most people dismiss it as an attempt at horror fiction. I wish it was. The truth is far more terrifying. Something is out there in that vast desert, something ancient and hungry that can reach into your mind and twist your deepest emotions against you. I don't know what it wanted from me or why it let me escape, but I know I'll never be free of it. That melodic song and those spiraling stones will haunt me for the rest of my days. We arrived at the campsite on a sunny Friday afternoon. Maggie was practically bouncing with excitement, going on about the mountain's spiritual energy and mystical reputation. Alex just rolled his eyes and started setting up his fancy camera equipment. He was hoping to get some great landscape shots for his portfolio. I helped unpack the car, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. Something about this place felt off. That first evening around the campfire was nice enough. We reminisced about college, made s'mores, shared a few beers. But as night fell, an eerie stillness settled over the forest. The crickets and frogs went silent. Even the wind seemed to die down. I tried to shake off my unease, telling myself it was just typical woods at night. But then our phones and watches started going haywire. The screens would flicker and glitch out, showing impossible times and garbled text. Alex's camera refused to focus, every shot coming out blurry and distorted. When Maggie pulled out a compass, the needle spun wildly in all directions. "Guys, maybe we should head back in the morning," I suggested nervously. "This is getting weird." Maggie laughed it off. "Oh, come on, Hannah. This is all part of the Shasta experience. The mountain is just welcoming us." I wish I'd insisted we leave right then, because that's when things got truly terrifying. It started with shadows moving between the trees, too fast and fluid to be natural. Then came the whispers on the wind, unintelligible but distinctly there. We all huddled closer to the fire, trying to convince ourselves it was just our imaginations. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I kept catching glimpses of something, just at the edge of my vision. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. We barely slept that night. In the morning, Maggie was oddly chipper, insisting we go on a hike to commune with the mountain spirits. Alex and I exchanged worried glances, but reluctantly agreed. Big mistake. About an hour into our hike, Maggie suddenly veered off the trail, saying she heard something calling her. We tried to stop her, but she took off running through the underbrush. Alex and I gave chase, calling her name, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air. 1 second she was right in front of us, the next, gone. Panic set in as we searched for hours, our calls echoing unanswered through the trees. As the sun began to set, we knew we had to head back to camp and get help. But on the way, we heard Maggie's voice in the distance. "Guys, over here, I found something amazing." Alex immediately started towards the voice, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said, my blood running cold. That doesn't sound quite right." He pulled away from me. "What are you talking about? That's clearly Maggie." But as I listened, I realized the voice was slightly off. The cadence was wrong, like someone doing an impersonation. Before I could stop him, Alex took off running towards the voice. "Alex, no!" I screamed. But he disappeared into the darkening woods. I stood there frozen, torn between following and running back to camp. That's when I saw it, a shape moving through the trees. At first I thought it was Alex or Maggie, but as it got closer, I realized with horror that it wasn't human at all. It was shifting, changing. One moment it looked like a massive wolf, the next like a bear, then something wholly unnatural. But its eyes, God, those eyes, glowing with an otherworldly intelligence and malice. I ran, blind terror propelling me through the forest, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear it behind me, moving impossibly fast. Sometimes it sounded like it was running on 4 legs, other times like it was swinging through the trees. When I finally burst into our campsite, I grabbed my phone with trembling hands, praying it would work long enough to call for help. But the creature's presence seemed to sap the energy from everything electronic. The phone was dead. I looked up to see it emerge from the tree line. In the fading light, its form was constantly shifting and changing, but always wrong, distorted, unnatural. It let out a sound, part growl, part scream, that chilled me to my core. What happened next is mostly a blur. I remember running again, the creature always right behind me. The forest seemed to come alive around us, branches reaching out to grab me, roots rising up to trip me. I heard Alex and Maggie's voices calling out, but I knew it wasn't really them. Somehow, I made it to my car. I don't even remember starting it or driving away. I just know I didn't stop until I was miles away from that godforsaken mountain. It's been weeks now, and there's been no sign of Maggie or Alex. Search parties found no trace of them. The police think they just got lost in the woods, but I know the truth. That thing took them. And sometimes late at night I swear I can still hear it, whispering, calling, waiting. I don't know what that creature was. A skinwalker? Some ancient forest spirit? Or something even older and darker? All I know is that Mount Shasta is not what it seems. There are things out there beyond our understanding, things that should be left alone. If you're planning a trip to Shasta, please, I'm begging you, stay away. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some places are better left unexplored. I learned that the hard way, and I'll be living with the consequences for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be just another trip for my travel blog. I've been doing this for years now, exploring supposedly haunted locations, debunking myths, capturing cool footage for my followers. But what happened at Devil's Slide was different. It shook me to my core. I'd heard rumors about the ghost of Clara Nash haunting the cliffs near Pacifica. It sounded like perfect content, beautiful coastal scenery, a spooky gold rush era legend, the works. I figured I'd camp out for a night or two, maybe catch some eerie mist on camera, spin a fun story for my audience. God, I was so naive. I arrived at Devil's Slide Trail late in the afternoon. The fog was already rolling in, which I was thrilled about. Great atmosphere for photos. I hiked along the bluffs, taking in the view. It really was stunning, in a stark, lonely kind of way. Jagged cliffs plunging down to the churning ocean below. I could see why it had a reputation for being haunted. As the sun started to set, I set up my camera to do a time-lapse of the fading light over the water. That's when I first heard it, a woman's voice, singing softly. I figured it was just drifting over from somewhere down the trail. But when I turned to look, there was no one there, just me and the empty cliffs. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and focus on getting my shots, but as it got darker, things just felt off. The mist seemed to move in unnatural ways, swirling and eddying around me. A few times I could have sworn I saw a pale figure out of the corner of my eye, but it always vanished when I turned to look. When I checked my camera, some of the photos had inexplicable orbs of light in them. I'm usually the first one to debunk that kind of thing as dust particles or lens flare. But these were different. They seemed to have an intentional quality to them, like they were trying to form a pattern. I decided to do a late-night live stream for my followers, thinking maybe they'd see something I was missing. As I was setting up, the singing started again. This time it was clearer, mournful, a lament about lost love and betrayal. I panned the camera around, trying to catch the source. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the cliff, a woman in a tattered white dress. Her long dark hair whipped around her face in the wind. For a second I thought she was just another hiker who had wandered too close to the edge. I called out, warning her to be careful. She turned, and I felt my blood run cold. Her face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with hollow black eyes. She stared right at me, and I swear I could feel the weight of decades of grief and rage in that gaze. I stumbled backwards, nearly dropping my camera. When I looked again, she was gone, but I could still hear that eerie singing echoing off the cliffs. My hands were shaking as I ended the live stream early. Comments were flooding in from viewers saying they'd seen the woman too. Some were freaking out, others calling it an elaborate hoax. I wished it was just a hoax. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just my imagination running wild in the dark. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I thought about packing up and leaving right then. God, I wish I had. Instead, like an idiot, I decided to keep investigating. I convinced myself it would make for an amazing story. I started researching the legend of Clara Nash on my phone, trying to piece together her history. Apparently, she had come to California during the gold rush, following a lover who had promised to marry her. But he abandoned her, leaving her pregnant and alone in a harsh, unfamiliar land. She wandered the coast for months, searching for him, before finally throwing herself from the cliffs in despair. As I read, the temperature around me plummeted. My phone started glitching, the screen flickering with static. In the brief flashes, I could see messages appearing. He lied. Find it. Help me. I dropped the phone, my heart pounding. The mist was closing in around me, so thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me. And in that mist, I started seeing shapes, spectral figures that seemed to be reenacting scenes from Clara's life. I saw her hopeful arrival in California, her desperate search along the coast, her betrayal and heartbreak. It was like the cliffs themselves were projecting her memories. I felt overwhelmed by waves of her emotions: love, fear, anger, despair. I tried to run, but it was like moving through molasses. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift and ripple. I could hear Clara's voice all around me now, no longer singing but screaming in anguish. Suddenly she was there in front of me, her hollow eyes boring into mine. She reached out a skeletal hand, her fingers brushing my cheek. It felt like being touched by ice. "You must find it," she rasped. "He took everything from me. My love, my child, my life. But I hid something from him. Find it. Return what was stolen." I wanted to ask what she meant, but I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed with terror. Clara's form started to waver and distort. The mist swirled around her, and for a moment I saw her as she must have been in life, a beautiful young woman with hope in her eyes. Then her face contorted in rage, and she lunged at me. I felt a searing pain in my chest, like claws raking across my heart. I screamed and fell to my knees. When I looked up, Clara was gone. The mist was dissipating, and I could see the first light of dawn on the horizon. As my terror subsided, I became aware of something cold and heavy around my neck. I reached up and felt a locket there, old and tarnished. I knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't been there before. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a tiny painted portrait of a man, presumably Clara's lover, and a lock of dark hair. As I stared at it, I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew that somehow Clara had bound me to her unfinished business. I gathered my things and got the hell out of there as fast as I could. But even as I drove away, I could feel Clara's presence lingering. In the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of a woman in white standing on the cliffs, watching me go. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that eerie singing. The locket feels heavier every day, like it's pulling me back to Devil's Slide. I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to destroy the locket, sever whatever connection I have to Clara's spirit. But another part feels like I have a responsibility now. She's entrusted me with something, and until I figure out what it means, I don't think I'll ever be free of her. I haven't been able to bring myself to post any of the footage or photos from that night. How can I possibly explain what happened? Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced was real. Clara Nash is out there, trapped between worlds, and somehow I've become entangled in her tragic story. I'm not sure what my next move is, but I know I'll have to return to Devil's Slide eventually. Clara is waiting for me there, and I have a feeling she won't rest until her unfinished business is resolved. I just hope I'm prepared for whatever happens when I face her again. If you're ever hiking those coastal trails near Pacifica, be careful. And if you hear singing on the wind, turn back. Some legends are more than just stories, and some ghosts don't want to be left alone. I was camping in Mariposa Grove with my boyfriend Ben, his sister Sadie, and our friend Jonah. I've never been much of an outdoorsy person, but Ben convinced me to come along, saying it would be a fun weekend getaway. If only I had known what we were really getting ourselves into. The first day started off normal enough. We hiked through the massive sequoia trees, taking photos and enjoying the fresh air. Jonah, who's really into folklore and mythology, kept going on about how spiritually significant the grove was to the native peoples. He mentioned something about a guardian spirit that protected the land and punished those who disrespected it. I mostly tuned him out, thinking it was just more of his usual nerdy rambling. As the day went on, things started to feel off. The trails seemed to shift and change, leading us in circles, even though we were following the map. We kept hearing this eerie whistling sound echoing through the trees, but could never pinpoint where it was coming from. The wildlife was acting strange, too. We saw a deer standing completely still, staring at us with unblinking eyes for what felt like minutes. When the sun started to set, we realized we had somehow gotten way off course and were much deeper in the forest than we intended. That's when the real terror began. It started with voices, whispers that sounded just like our own, calling out from the darkness between the trees. We'd hear Ben's voice coming from one direction, then Sadie's from another, even though they were right next to us. It was like the forest itself was trying to separate us. Then we saw it for the first time, a towering figure with glowing amber eyes and antler-like protrusions. It moved with impossible speed and grace, ducking behind trees and vanishing into shadows. One second it looked like a massive bear, the next like a skeletal deer. The sight of it filled me with a primal terror I've never experienced before or since. We tried to run, but the forest seemed to come alive around us. Roots rose up to trip us, branches swung down to block our path. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. I heard my own voice screaming for help, even though I wasn't making a sound. Jonah started babbling about how we needed to make an offering to appease the spirit. He was convinced it was the only way any of us would make it out alive. Before we could stop him, he took off running deeper into the woods, shouting that he would sacrifice himself so the rest of us could escape. We never saw Jonah again. Part of me hopes he just got lost and eventually found his way out, but deep down I know that's not what happened. Whatever that thing in the forest was, it took him. The rest of that night is a blur of terror and confusion. Somehow Ben, Sadie, and I managed to stay together and find our way back to the campsite as dawn broke. We grabbed our stuff and got the hell out of there as fast as we could. It's been months since that night, but I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. I wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I can hear that eerie whistling outside my window. Ben and Sadie won't talk about what happened. I think we're all afraid that speaking about it will somehow make it more real. I've tried researching similar encounters in Mariposa Grove, but haven't found anything concrete. Just vague legends and campfire stories that don't come close to the horror we experienced. Part of me wants answers, wants to understand what that thing was and why it targeted us. But mostly, I just want to forget it ever happened. I know how crazy this all sounds. Before that night, I would have laughed if someone told me a story like this. But I know what I saw, what I felt. There's something ancient and powerful in those woods, something beyond human understanding. And it's still out there, waiting. I won't ever go back to Mariposa Grove. No amount of natural beauty is worth the risk of encountering that spirit again. Sometimes when I'm alone in the quiet, I swear I can still hear that whistling on the wind, calling me back. But I won't answer. I can't. If you're planning a trip to Yosemite, stick to the well-traveled paths. Don't venture too deep into the forest, especially as night falls. And if you hear whispers or see glowing eyes in the darkness, run. Run and don't look back. You might just make it out alive. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that night. Was it really some ancient forest spirit, or just a shared hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion? The rational part of my brain wants to explain it away, but I know deep down that what we experienced was real. In the weeks after we got back, I obsessively researched the history and legends of Mariposa Grove. I found references to a guardian of the forest in some Native American stories, but nothing that matched the terrifying entity we encountered. It's like the spirit exists just outside of human knowledge, powerful enough to affect our world, but too alien for us to truly comprehend. The psychological toll has been immense. I have panic attacks when I'm in densely wooded areas now. The sound of wind through leaves sends my heart racing. I've had to start seeing a therapist, but I can't bring myself to tell her the full story. How do you explain something like this to someone who wasn't there? Ben and I tried to stay together after the incident, but the shared trauma was too much. We'd wake up screaming, thinking we were back in those woods. Eventually, we realized we couldn't heal while constantly reminding each other of what happened. We broke up a month ago. Sadie's taken it the hardest. She blames herself for not stopping Jonah when he ran off. She's become a recluse, barely leaving her apartment. The last time I spoke to her, she was convinced the spirit was stalking her, that it had followed us out of the forest. I want to believe it's just paranoia, but after what we saw, I can't be sure. I've thought about trying to warn people, to stop others from experiencing what we did. But who would believe me? And what if drawing attention to it somehow made things worse? What if it attracted the spirit's attention again? There are nights when I lie awake, wondering if we did something to provoke it. Did we unknowingly disrespect the land somehow? Or were we just in the wrong place at the wrong time, encountering something that was never meant for human eyes? The worst part is the not knowing. Not knowing what exactly that thing was, what it wanted, why it let us go. Not knowing what happened to Jonah. Not knowing if it's truly over, or if someday I'll turn a corner and see those glowing amber eyes staring back at me. I try to go on with my life, to pretend everything's normal, but I know now that the world is stranger and more terrifying than I ever imagined. There are ancient, powerful forces out there that we can't begin to understand. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you might just catch their attention. So I'll keep telling my story, hoping that maybe someone out there has answers, or at least that it might serve as a warning to others. Be careful in the wilderness. Respect the land and its history. And if you ever find yourself in Mariposa Grove as the sun sets, get out. Get out while you still can. Because once the forest spirit notices you, it never truly lets you go. Even now, months later and hundreds of miles away, I can feel its presence, watching, waiting, a constant reminder that there are some mysteries we're not meant to unravel, some encounters we can never truly recover from. I don't know if I'll ever fully heal from what happened in those woods, but I'm trying. Day by day, I'm trying to reclaim my life, to find a new normal. And if sharing my story helps even one person avoid a similar fate, then maybe some good can come from all this horror. Just remember, the next time you're alone in the forest and hear an unexplained whistle on the wind, run. Run like your life depends on it, because it just might. Last fall, I decided to take a solo trip to Mono Lake. I'm a writer, recently divorced, and I desperately needed some time away to work on my book about California folklore. Mono Lake seemed like the perfect spot, quiet, isolated, and steeped in local legends. I packed up my RV and hit the road, excited for some much-needed solitude. When I arrived, I was immediately struck by the otherworldly beauty of the place. The tufa towers rising out of the water, the eerie stillness. It was breathtaking. I set up camp at a secluded spot near the shore and settled in to write. The first few days were wonderfully peaceful. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and spend hours working on my laptop with the lake as my backdrop. In the evenings, I'd take long walks along the shore, soaking in the atmosphere. It felt like exactly what I needed to clear my head and focus on my writing. On my fourth day there, I met James, one of the park rangers. He was friendly enough, but there was an edge to his voice when he asked how long I was planning to stay. When I told him I'd be there for a couple of weeks, he hesitated before warning me to be careful around the lake, especially at night. "There's a lot of history in these waters," he said cryptically. "Not all of it good." I brushed off his warning at first. After all, I was there to research folklore. A few spooky stories were exactly what I was looking for. But that night, as I sat outside my RV watching the sunset, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. The silence suddenly felt oppressive rather than peaceful. As darkness fell, I thought I heard singing, a faint lilting melody that seemed to be coming from the direction of the lake. I strained my ears, but it faded away as quickly as it had come. Probably just the wind, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there watching me. The next morning, I woke early and went for a walk to clear my head. The lake was shrouded in mist, giving it an even more otherworldly appearance than usual. As I picked my way carefully along the shore, movement caught my eye. Through the fog, I saw what looked like a small figure standing near the water's edge. My heart racing, I called out, "Hello!" The figure turned, and I saw it was a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress that looked like something from the early 1900s. What was a child doing out here alone? "Are you lost?" I asked, hurrying towards her. "Where are your parents?" As I got closer, the girl's appearance made my blood run cold. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her eyes had a glassy, faraway look. When she spoke, her voice was soft and echoing, as if coming from very far away. "I'm looking for my mama and papa," she said. "Have you seen them?" Before I could respond, she turned and ran off into the mist. I called after her and tried to follow, but she vanished as if she'd never been there at all. Shaken, I hurried back to my campsite, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real, and it was only the beginning. Over the next few days, strange occurrences became more and more frequent. I'd wake up to find mysterious barefoot prints circling my RV, despite the rocky terrain. The eerie singing I'd heard that first night returned, sometimes seeming to come from right outside my window. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly at them. And the girl, Ella, she eventually told me her name was, kept appearing, sometimes at a distance, watching me silently from the shore. Other times she'd materialize right next to me, causing me to jump out of my skin. She never stayed long, always running off when I tried to talk to her. But her visits left me increasingly unsettled. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Lack of sleep, an overactive imagination fueled by my research. There had to be a logical explanation. But with each passing day, it became harder to deny the truth. Something supernatural was going on, and it was centered around that little girl and the lake itself. Desperate for answers, I started digging into local history. I learned that in the early 1900s, several children had gone missing in the area, their bodies never found. There were old legends about spirits trapped in the alkaline waters of the lake, unable to move on to the afterlife. The more I uncovered, the more terrified I became. But I couldn't leave, not without figuring out what was really going on. What did Ella want? Why was she appearing to me? Things came to a head on what would be my last night at Mono Lake. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night to find Ella standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please," she whispered, "you have to help us. We can't get out." Heart pounding, I followed her out of the RV. The night was eerily still, the lake's surface like black glass. As we approached the shore, I saw movement in the water. Shadowy figures were rising up, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. Ella walked towards them, and I realized with horror that they were reaching for her, trying to pull her in. I lunged forward, grabbing her arm to pull her back, but my hand passed right through her as if she were made of mist. The shadows swarmed around us, their whispers filling the air. I caught fragments of words: trapped, help us, set us free. Ella's form began to flicker and fade. Panic overtook me. I stumbled backward, away from the grasping shadows and Ella's disappearing form. I ran back to my RV, my heart feeling like it would burst from my chest. As soon as I was inside, I started the engine and peeled out of there, not even bothering to pack up my campsite. I drove straight through until morning, putting as much distance between myself and Mono Lake as possible. It wasn't until I stopped for gas that I noticed something in the passenger seat. A small, old-fashioned child's shoe. Ella's shoe. I don't know how to explain what happened to me at Mono Lake. I've spent months trying to rationalize it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And I know that somewhere out there, trapped between worlds, Ella and the others are still waiting for someone to set them free. I haven't been back to Mono Lake since that night. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when it's very quiet, I swear I can still hear that faint, haunting melody carried on the wind. And I wonder, what if I had stayed? What if I had found a way to help them? The questions haunt me, but I'll never know the answers. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, and sometimes it's better to leave them undisturbed. It was supposed to be a routine trip. As a survival expert and YouTuber, I've spent years exploring remote locations and documenting my experiences. Lake Shasta had been on my radar for a while, with its complex cave systems and rich history. I packed up my RV and headed out, excited for a solo adventure and the chance to create some unique content for my channel. The first few days were uneventful. I set up camp near the lake and spent my time hiking, exploring the area, and gathering information from locals. That's when I met Maggie Coates, a local historian who seemed hesitant to discuss the area's history at first. But as we talked, she opened up about some of the darker legends surrounding Lake Shasta. "Be careful in those caves, Daniel," she warned me, her eyes intense. "There are stories, old stories about things that shouldn't exist, things that hunger." I brushed off her concerns at first. After all, I'd heard plenty of local legends in my travels, and they usually amounted to nothing more than campfire tales. But something in Maggie's voice stuck with me, a note of genuine fear that I couldn't shake. On my third day of exploring the caves, I found the journal. It was tucked away in a crevice, its leather cover cracked and weathered with age. As I carefully turned the brittle pages, I realized I was reading a first-hand account of a group of settlers who had been trapped in these very caves during a brutal winter in the mid-1800s. The journal detailed their desperate struggle for survival as food ran low and temperatures plummeted. But it was the final entries that chilled me to the bone. The writer described resorting to cannibalism and then something else. Something awakening in the caves, drawn by their desperation and the taste of human flesh. I tried to convince myself it was just the ramblings of a man driven mad by starvation and isolation. But as I made my way deeper into the cave system, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just little things, equipment going missing, unexplained noises echoing through the tunnels. But then I started hearing voices. "Help! Is anyone there?" The cry was faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere deeper in the caves. I called out in response, but there was no answer. I spent hours searching, following the sound of that voice, but I never found its source. As night fell, I made camp in a large cavern, setting up my camera to capture some night footage. That's when I noticed the claw marks. They were everywhere, deep gouges in the rock walls, far too large to have been made by any animal I knew of, and they looked fresh. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then, but my curiosity and stubbornness won out. I convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation, and I was determined to find it. The next day, things escalated quickly. As I ventured deeper into the cave system, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. That's when I heard the voice again, but this time it was different. "Daniel? Daniel, is that you?" It was a man's voice, filled with relief and desperation. "Oh, thank God. I've been lost down here for days. Please, help me," I called out, asking who was there and where they were. The voice identified itself as Evan, a hiker who had gotten separated from his group. He begged me to come find him, insisting he was injured and couldn't move. Every instinct told me something was wrong, but I couldn't just leave someone in need. I cautiously made my way towards the source of the voice, my headlamp cutting through the darkness. As I rounded a corner, I saw a figure huddled against the far wall of a small chamber. "Evan," I called out, "are you okay?" The figure turned and I felt my blood run cold. It wasn't human, not even close. Its body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over an impossibly tall frame. Its face was a twisted mockery of human features, with sunken eyes that glowed with an unnatural hunger. And then it spoke again, in Evan's voice. "Daniel, thank you for coming. I'm so hungry." I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, my heart pounding in my ears as I scrambled through the twisting tunnels. I could hear it behind me, its inhuman shrieks echoing off the cave walls. Somehow, I made it back to my camp, grabbing my emergency pack and bolting for the cave entrance. But it was waiting for me. Somehow, it had circled around, cutting off my escape. In the dim light of my headlamp, I could see it more clearly now. Its limbs were impossibly long, ending in razor-sharp claws. Its mouth was filled with rows of needle-like teeth, and its eyes, God, its eyes were full of intelligence and malice. "Why run, Daniel?" it asked, its voice a perfect mimic of my own. "Don't you want to document this? Isn't this the adventure you were looking for?" I was cornered, trapped between the creature and the depths of the cave. In desperation, I grabbed a flare from my pack and ignited it, hoping the bright light would drive it back. The creature hissed and recoiled, giving me just enough time to dash past it. I ran until my lungs burned, not daring to look back. I could hear it pursuing me, its footsteps unnaturally fast. As I neared the cave entrance, I had an idea. I pulled out my last 2 flares and waited until I could sense the creature right behind me. With a silent prayer, I ignited both flares and hurled them at the cave ceiling just as I dove for the entrance. The blast was deafening, and I felt rocks and debris raining down around me. I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, choking on dust and praying the cave-in would be enough. As the dust settled, I found myself outside, battered and bruised but alive. The cave entrance was completely blocked by fallen rocks. For a moment, there was silence. Then, faintly, I heard its voice one last time. "This isn't over, Daniel. We'll meet again. After all, I have all the time in the world." I didn't stop running until I reached my RV. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and Lake Shasta as I could. It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that voice in my dreams. I don't know what that thing was. A Wendigo, a skinwalker, or something else entirely. All I know is that it's still out there, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the wilderness, I could swear I hear it calling my name. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to find some logical explanation, but deep down, I know what I saw was real. It was ancient, intelligent, and hungry in a way that went beyond mere physical appetite. It hungered for fear, for despair, for the very essence of human suffering. I've stopped making videos. How could I go back to cheerfully documenting survival techniques when I know what's really out there? But I felt I had to share this story to warn others. If you're planning a trip to Lake Shasta, especially to explore the caves, please reconsider. And if you do go, and you hear a voice calling for help in the darkness, run, and don't look back. Because sometimes the true horrors of this world aren't the ones we can see or understand. They're the ones that lurk just beyond the edge of our comprehension, waiting for the moment when we stumble into their domain. And once they have your scent, they never truly let you go. I never believed in the supernatural. As a historian and documentarian, I've always approached unexplained phenomena with a skeptical eye, seeking rational explanations for the seemingly inexplicable. But what happened to me at Devil's Gate Dam shattered my understanding of reality and left me questioning everything I thought I knew. It was supposed to be a routine research trip for my YouTube series debunking paranormal claims. I'd heard about the dark legends surrounding Devil's Gate Dam in Pasadena, stories of occult rituals, disappearances, and a supernatural presence. Perfect fodder for my channel. I packed up my RV with cameras and recording equipment, ready to spend a few days investigating and filming. The dam itself was an imposing concrete structure, its angular face looming over the surrounding wilderness. As I set up my equipment, I noticed an older man watching me from a maintenance shed. He introduced himself as Ray, a local worker, and his weathered face creased with concern as he asked about my plans. "You shouldn't be poking around here," Ray warned, his voice low. "This place has a dark history. Things happen here that can't be explained." I smiled politely, assuring him I was just doing some harmless filming. But something in Ray's eyes made me uneasy. He seemed genuinely afraid. As night fell, I began my investigation in earnest. I set up cameras around the dam and started recording, narrating my observations for the video. At first, everything seemed normal, but as the hours passed, a creeping sense of unease settled over me. It started with whispers. Faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but they grew louder, more insistent, impossible whispers that seemed to come from the very walls of the dam itself. I tried to rationalize it, tricks of the wind, my own imagination, but they felt so real, so present. Then I noticed the symbols, strange, angular shapes carved into the concrete that I was certain hadn't been there before. They seemed to shimmer and shift in the moonlight, as if alive. I approached one, running my fingers over the rough surface. The stone was cool to the touch, but as I traced the symbol, a jolt of energy surged through my arm, making me stumble back. That's when I saw it for the first time. A dark figure at the edge of my vision. Tall and unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. I whirled around, but it was gone. Heart pounding, I tried to convince myself it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. I retreated to my RV, hands shaking as I reviewed the footage. What I saw chilled me to my core. In several frames, a shadowy figure stood behind me, its featureless face turned towards the camera. And in one horrifying clip, I saw myself turn to face the camera, but my eyes were hollow sockets and my mouth was stretched in an impossible, unnatural grin. Sleep was impossible. The whispers continued, now accompanied by scratching sounds on the walls of the RV. I huddled in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense, waiting for dawn. But as the first light of morning broke, I realized with horror that the shadows inside the RV weren't receding. They were growing, coalescing into that same tall, thin figure I'd seen before. I scrambled out of the RV, heart racing. The dam loomed before me, its concrete face now covered in those shifting, shimmering symbols. And standing atop it was the Shadow Man, its empty face turned towards me. Time seemed to stretch and warp. One moment, the figure was on the dam. The next, it was right beside me, its cold presence sending waves of terror through my body. I ran, my feet pounding against the rocky ground. But no matter how fast I moved, the Shadow Man was always there, just at the edge of my vision. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. The sun climbed higher, but the shadows never lessened. Finally, exhausted and terrified, I collapsed near the base of the dam. That's when I noticed the burnt paper fragments scattered on the ground. With trembling hands, I gathered them up. They were covered in more of those strange symbols, but these felt different, older, more powerful. As I studied them, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just noise anymore. They were words in a language I didn't understand but somehow knew. A cold realization washed over me. These symbols, this language, they were a key to something, a door to somewhere else. And by finding them, by understanding them, I had started to open that door. The world around me began to shift and warp. The concrete of the dam pulsed with unnatural energy, the symbols writhing across its surface. Reality itself seemed to be tearing at the seams. And then, suddenly, I was standing on top of the dam. I had no memory of climbing up there, no idea how I'd arrived. The Shadow Man stood before me, its presence overwhelming. I felt something pushing at the edges of my mind, trying to take control. In desperation, I grabbed one of the burnt paper fragments. Acting on instinct, I traced one of the symbols in the air between us. There was a flash of light, a screech of unearthly rage, and the Shadow Man was gone. I stumbled back to my RV, my mind reeling. As I drove away from Devil's Gate Dam, I thought it was over. But I was wrong. The whispers still follow me, growing louder in the dark of night. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of that tall, thin figure. I don't know what I encountered at Devil's Gate Dam. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it. But I know this. There are things in this world beyond our comprehension, forces that defy explanation. And sometimes when we go looking for answers, we open doors that were never meant to be opened. I came to Devil's Gate Dam as a skeptic, determined to debunk the supernatural. I left as a man haunted by forces I can't explain, marked by an encounter that defies reality. The whispers still echo in my mind, and I fear that whatever I encountered there hasn't finished with me yet. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself tracing those symbols again, feeling that surge of otherworldly energy. And I wonder, did I really close that door? Or did I just bring a piece of it back with me? I don't make videos debunking the paranormal anymore. How could I, when I've seen firsthand that there are things in this world that defy explanation? Instead, I find myself poring over ancient texts, searching for more information about those symbols, about the entity I encountered. But a part of me knows that I'm playing with fire, that by seeking answers I might be opening that door even wider. Yet I can't stop. The whispers won't let me. They're always there, just at the edge of hearing, urging me to dig deeper, to uncover more secrets. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever find the answers I'm looking for, or if those answers will destroy me. But I do know this. The world is stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. And sometimes, the things we dismiss as superstition or legend are all too real. To anyone reading this, be careful what you go looking for, because sometimes the unknown looks back, and once it sees you, it never lets go. My name's Ben, and I run a YouTube channel where I document hiking trips. It was supposed to be just another adventure. Me, my girlfriend Nina, our friend Travis, and a new girl named Kelly who wanted to join us. We'd heard Hedge Creek Valley was beautiful but remote, perfect for some killer footage. The first day started normal enough. We hiked a few miles in, joking around and enjoying the scenery. But as we got deeper into the valley, things felt off. I noticed weird markings on some of the trees, symbols I'd never seen before. When I pointed them out to the others, Kelly got real quiet. As the day went on, we all started feeling on edge. There was this constant sensation of being watched. I kept hearing what sounded like faint whistling, but when I'd stop to listen, there was nothing. Nina said she felt it too. We set up camp as it got dark, and that's when shit got real weird. Kelly started acting strange, jumpy, paranoid. She swore she could hear voices calling her name from the woods. We all told her it was just the wind, but I wasn't so sure anymore. In the middle of the night, I woke up to Kelly screaming. She was thrashing in her tent, yelling about something in the shadows. When we got her calmed down, she was drenched in sweat, eyes wild. She kept saying, "It's here. It found us." None of us slept after that. As the sky lightened, we decided to pack up and get the hell out. That's when Travis noticed the tracks around our campsite. Massive paw prints, way bigger than any animal in these parts. And they were everywhere, circling our tents. We started hiking out fast, not even stopping to eat. The whole forest felt wrong, like it was closing in on us. Trails that should have been there were overgrown. Landmarks I swore we'd passed before appeared again. It was like the valley itself was trying to keep us there. Then we heard it, a blood-curdling scream that didn't sound human. Kelly freaked, saying it was the thing that had been calling to her. Before we could stop her, she bolted into the woods. Travis went after her. That was the last time I saw Travis alive. Nina and I waited, calling their names. After an hour, we knew we had to go look. What we found, God, I still see it when I close my eyes. There was Kelly standing in a clearing, but it wasn't Kelly, not really. Her skin looked wrong, stretched, and her eyes, they were solid black. When she saw us, she smiled, and her mouth opened way too wide, full of razor-sharp teeth. I grabbed Nina's hand and we ran. Behind us, I heard this awful squelching sound, like flesh tearing. I looked back and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing wearing Kelly's skin was changing, growing, its limbs elongating grotesquely, skin rippling as it took on a new form. We ran until our lungs burned, crashing through the underbrush. Somehow we made it back to the trailhead. I've never been so glad to see my beat-up Jeep. The police didn't believe us, of course. They're still searching for Travis and Kelly, but they'll never find them. Whatever that thing was, Skinwalker, Wendigo, I don't know. It has them now. I haven't been able to pick up my camera since. Nina won't even talk about what happened. But I know what I saw out there. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, predators that see us as nothing but prey, and sometimes they find us. I'm done with hiking, done with the woods, but I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that inhuman whistling outside my window. And I wonder, did we really escape, or did it just let us go? It was supposed to be a routine research trip. As a wildlife conservation researcher, I've spent countless hours in forests across the country, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on the Blackfeather Trail. The day started like any other. I packed my gear, double-checked my camera equipment, and set out at dawn. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I should have taken that as the first warning sign, but I was too focused on my mission to document rare bird species. As I hiked deeper into the forest, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The trees seemed to loom larger, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. About 2 hours into my hike, I came across an old woman standing in the middle of the trail. She seemed out of place, her weathered face a stark contrast to the lush greenery around us. "Turn back," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "This forest doesn't take kindly to strangers." I laughed it off, thinking she was just a local trying to scare away tourists. If only I had listened. As I continued down the trail, I noticed something unusual on the ground. It was a massive black feather, easily the size of my forearm. But there was something off about it. The texture was almost metallic, and it seemed to shimmer in the dappled sunlight. I picked it up, marveling at its weight and the way it caught the light. Little did I know that feather would become the focal point of the horror that was about to unfold. I tucked the feather into my backpack and pressed on. That's when things started to get weird. My GPS started glitching, showing me impossible locations. My phone lost signal, even though I'd had full bars just moments before. I tried to take some photos of the surrounding area, but my camera kept malfunctioning, the screen filling with static every time I tried to snap a picture. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I'd turn to look, there'd be nothing there. The trees seemed to whisper, their leaves rustling even when there was no wind. I decided to set up camp for the night, hoping things would seem clearer in the morning. As I was pitching my tent, I noticed a strange mark on my arm. It looked like a small black feather had been etched into my skin. I tried to rub it off, thinking it was dirt or some kind of weird shadow, but it wouldn't budge. That night was the longest of my life. The forest came alive with sounds I couldn't explain, screeches that were too low to be birds, but too high to be any mammal I knew of. Shadows danced outside my tent, cast by a light source I couldn't identify. I barely slept, and when dawn finally broke, I decided to cut my trip short and head back. But as I started to pack up, I realized the trail looked different. Landmarks I'd noted the day before were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. It was as if the forest itself had shifted overnight. Panic started to set in as I realized I was lost. I tried to use my compass, but the needle spun wildly, never settling on a direction. That's when I saw it, a massive bird-like creature perched on a branch above me. But this was no ordinary bird. Its wingspan must have been 15 feet across, and its feathers were that same metallic black as the one I'd found. Our eyes met, and in that moment I felt a jolt of recognition. This creature, whatever it was intelligent, and it was angry. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Branches whipped at my face, Roots seemed to reach up to trip me. The forest was alive and it was trying to stop me. As I ran, the world around me began to warp. Trees bent at impossible angles. The ground rippled like water. I saw flashes of other places, other times. For a split second, I swear I saw that old woman again, her eyes now glowing with an otherworldly light. I don't know how long I ran or how I found my way out. One moment I was in that nightmare forest. The next I was stumbling onto the main road, gasping for air. It's been weeks since that day, but I still can't shake what happened. The mark on my arm hasn't faded. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'll catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure watching me. And at night, I dream of that forest, of the creature, of the old woman's warning. I've tried to make sense of it all. I've researched local legends, consulted experts in folklore and the paranormal, but nothing comes close to explaining what I experienced. The photos from my trip are the final piece of this terrifying puzzle. Most of them are corrupted, just static and bizarre light patterns, but a few came out clear, and in the background of every single one, barely visible but unmistakably there, are shadowy figures watching me. I don't know what that thing in the forest was. I don't know if it was some kind of ancient spirit, a creature science hasn't discovered yet, or something beyond our understanding. But I do know this. It's still out there. And a part of me, marked by that feather scar, will always belong to that forest. I'm sharing this story not because I expect anyone to believe me, but because I need to warn others. If you ever find yourself on the Black Feather Trail in Mendocino National Forest, turn back. Some places in this world aren't meant for us to explore. Some secrets are better left uncovered. As for me, I don't think I'll ever be able to step foot in a forest again. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, it all brings me back to that day. The day I learned that there are things in this world beyond our comprehension, things that don't take kindly to being disturbed. I hope by sharing this, I can prevent someone else from going through what I did. Because trust me, some experiences change you forever, and not all marks are visible on the outside. I had been driving for hours along the Lost Coast Highway, my old RV chugging along as I searched for the perfect shots to reinvigorate my struggling photography career. The fog was thick that day, hanging low over the winding road and obscuring the rugged coastline. I'd heard rumors of an abandoned stretch of highway out here, lost to time and forgotten by maps. As a photographer always chasing that next great image, I couldn't resist the lure of such a mysterious location. The clock on my dashboard read 3:47 p.m. when I first saw her. A lone figure standing on the side of the road, arm outstretched in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. I hesitated for a moment. Picking up strangers isn't exactly advisable these days. But something compelled me to slow down. Maybe it was the desolate surroundings, or maybe it was the strange, almost ethereal quality to her silhouette in the mist. Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling over. As she approached the RV, I got my first good look at her. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair and pale skin. Her clothes seemed oddly out of place, a flowy white dress that looked more suited for a summer picnic than a foggy coastal highway. But it was her eyes that really caught my attention. They seemed old somehow, like they'd seen far more than her youthful face would suggest. "Thanks for stopping," she said as she climbed in. Her voice was soft, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "I'm Janine." "Oliver," I replied. "Where are you headed?" She smiled, but it didn't quite reach those old eyes. Just up the road a ways, there's an old lodge I'm trying to get back to. As we drove, Janine directed me to turn off onto a smaller side road I hadn't even noticed before. The pavement quickly gave way to gravel, then to overgrown dirt barely recognizable as a road at all. The fog seemed to thicken with each passing mile, until I could barely see more than a few feet in front of the RV. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Janine nodded. "Trust me," she said softly. "We're almost there." Just when I was about to suggest turning back, the mist parted and I saw it. An old wooden lodge looming out of the fog like something from another era. The sign out front, barely legible beneath years of weathering, read, "Whispering Pines Lodge." "This is it," Janine said, her voice taking on an odd, echoing quality. "Pull over here." I did as she asked, cutting the engine and peering out at the dilapidated building. It looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in decades. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, windows were boarded up, and the porch sagged ominously. "What is this place?" I asked. But when I turned to look at Janine, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if she'd never been there at all. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped out of the RV, my camera clutched tightly in my hands. The air felt different here, heavier somehow, like the fog itself had substance. I took a few tentative steps toward the lodge, the gravel crunching loudly under my feet in the eerie silence. That's when I noticed something strange. The trees surrounding the lodge seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. One moment there'd be a tall pine, and the next it would be replaced by a gnarled oak. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. I raised my camera, hoping to capture some of this surreal scene. But when I looked through the viewfinder, what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing on the porch of the lodge, barely visible through the mist, was a figure. It was humanoid in shape, but where its face should have been was just blank, smooth, featureless skin. I lowered the camera, my heart pounding, but when I looked at the porch with my naked eye, there was nothing there. Shaking, I raised the camera again. This time, I saw not one but several of these faceless figures, all standing perfectly still, all facing me. I snapped a photo instinctively, the flash cutting through the gloom for a split second. In that brief moment of illumination, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. The figures weren't just on the porch anymore. They were all around me, surrounding the RV, standing motionless in the fog. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, fumbling with the RV keys as I sprinted back to the vehicle. I could feel them behind me, though I didn't dare look back. As I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door, I caught a glimpse of pale, blank faces pressing against the windows. The engine roared to life and I floored it, tires spinning in the gravel before finally finding purchase. I tore down that overgrown road, branches scraping against the sides of the RV as I swerved wildly through the fog. I don't know how long I drove. Minutes? Hours? The fog seemed endless, and more than once I was convinced I was going in circles. Landmarks would appear and then vanish. Roads that should have been there simply weren't. It was full dark by the time I finally broke free of the mist, finding myself back on the main highway. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, pulling into a well-lit gas station parking lot and collapsing against the steering wheel, my whole body shaking. It took me a long time to work up the courage to look at the photos I'd taken. Most of them were just fog and trees, nothing unusual. But then I got to the last one, the photo I'd snapped right before I ran. There they were, just as I remembered, dozens of faceless figures surrounding my RV. But there was something else. something I hadn't noticed in my panic. Standing in the doorway of the RV, barely visible, was Janine. She was looking right at the camera, a sad smile on her face. And behind her, inside the RV, was another faceless figure. I don't know what happened to me that day. I've tried to find that stretch of road again, tried to locate any record of a Whispering Pines lodge, but there's nothing. It's like it never existed, but I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. And sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear Janine's voice on the wind, whispering, "We're almost there." I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore, and I always check the back seat of my car before I get in, because ever since that day, I can't shake the feeling that I brought something back with me from that fog-shrouded road, something that's waiting for its chance to pull me back into that other world. And the worst part? Sometimes I find myself wanting to go back, to understand what happened, to see Janine again, to unravel the mystery of that place. But then I look at that photo, at those blank faces surrounding me, and I remember the terror I felt. And I know that if I ever do find my way back to that lonely stretch of highway, I might never leave again. I'm Emily, 28 years old, and I'd been going through a rough patch in my life. Work stress, a bad breakup, family drama, it all piled up, and I felt like I was drowning. I needed to get away, to clear my head and find myself again. That's why I decided to take a solo camping trip to Tahoe National Forest. Just me, my RV, and nature. No distractions, no responsibilities. It seemed perfect. I arrived at the campground near Donner Lake on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was cool and fresh, and the forest was alive with vibrant fall colors. As I set up my campsite, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was exactly what I needed. That first evening, I took a hike through the woods, breathing in the pine-scented air and listening to the rustling leaves. About a mile from my campsite, I stumbled upon something unexpected, an old, weathered grave marker partially hidden by undergrowth. Curious, I brushed away the leaves to read the faded inscription, Eleanor Pierce, 1846-1847. My heart skipped a beat as I realized this could be connected to the infamous Donner Party. I snapped a quick photo with my phone and headed back to camp, my mind racing with thoughts of the area's tragic history. As night fell, I built a small campfire and settled in with a book, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had come over me since finding the grave. That's when things started to get weird. At first, it was subtle, a twig snapping in the darkness when there was no wind, a fleeting shadow at the edge of the firelight. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. "Help me." I froze, my blood running cold. It sounded so close, yet when I whipped around, there was nothing there, just the dark, silent forest. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I tossed and turned in my RV, jumping at every creak and groan. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were plagued by visions of skeletal figures trudging through snow, their faces contorted in anguish. I woke up early the next morning, feeling drained and on edge. As I stepped out of the RV, my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw my backpack, which I distinctly remembered leaving inside the vehicle, now sitting on the ground, its contents spilled out. Among them was my camera, which I hadn't even unpacked yet. With shaking hands, I picked up the camera and turned it on. My jaw dropped as I scrolled through the photos. There were dozens of new images, all taken sometime during the night. Most were blurry or too dark to make out, but a few sent chills down my spine. ghostly faces pressed against the RV windows, their eyes hollow and pleading. I wanted to leave right then and there, to pack up and never look back. But something held me there, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a strange sense of obligation I couldn't explain. Throughout the day, the paranormal activity escalated. Objects would move when I wasn't looking, my coffee mug sliding across the picnic table, my jacket suddenly hanging from a tree branch I couldn't have reached. The whispers grew more frequent, sometimes forming words I could almost understand. But the most terrifying part was the figure I kept glimpsing at the edge of my vision. A woman in tattered 19th century clothing, her face gaunt and sorrowful. Every time I turned to look directly at her, she vanished, only to reappear moments later just out of reach. As night fell again, I huddled in my RV, every nerve on high alert. The temperature seemed to drop rapidly, my breath fogging in the air even though the heater was on full blast. The RV began to shake, softly at first, then with increasing violence. I heard scratching sounds on the roof and walls, as if dozens of hands were clawing to get in. Suddenly, everything went still. In the silence that followed, I heard a clear, mournful voice. "We never meant for this to happen. We were so hungry, so desperate. Please, help us find peace." My heart pounding, I peered out the window. There she was, the ghostly woman, standing just a few feet away. Her eyes locked with mine, and in that moment I felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow, regret, and a desperate longing for release. I don't know what came over me, but I found myself stepping outside. The ghost, Eleanor, I realized, watched me with a mixture of hope and anguish. Without fully understanding why, I knew what I had to do. I made my way back to the grave marker I'd found the day before. Eleanor's spirit followed, always just at the edge of my vision. When I reached the grave, I knelt down and began to speak. I apologized for the suffering she and the others had endured. I acknowledged their pain, their desperation, and the terrible choices they were forced to make. I promised to share their story, to ensure they wouldn't be forgotten. As I spoke, the air around me seemed to lighten. The oppressive feeling that had haunted me for the past 2 days began to lift. When I looked up, I saw Eleanor's spirit one last time. Her face had softened, a peaceful smile replacing the anguished expression. She nodded once, then slowly faded away. I spent the rest of the night by the grave, feeling both exhausted and oddly calm. When dawn broke, I packed up my campsite and headed home. The photos on my camera had vanished, leaving no physical evidence of what I'd experienced. But I know what happened. I can still feel it. This experience has changed me profoundly. I've spent weeks researching the Donner Party, trying to piece together Eleanor's story. I've gained a new perspective on historical trauma and the thin veil between our world and whatever lies beyond. I'm sharing this story not to scare anyone, but because I made a promise to remember, to acknowledge, and to help others find peace. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened in those woods, but I do know that sometimes the past reaches out to us in ways we can't explain. And when it does, the least we can do is listen. It all started when I decided to take a solo trip to clear my head after my divorce. At 36, I felt like my life was falling apart, and I needed some time alone to process everything. I chose Anza Borrego because it seemed remote enough to offer the solitude I craved. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the rugged mountains. The desert stretched out before me, vast and empty, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I set up my tent in a secluded spot, away from the main campgrounds, wanting to fully immerse myself in the wilderness. As night fell, I sat outside my tent, nursing a bottle of water and watching the stars come out. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the scrub brush. I felt small and insignificant under that enormous sky, but it was oddly comforting. It must have been around midnight when I first heard it, footsteps crunching on the gravelly soil. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe some nocturnal animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I called out, thinking maybe another camper had wandered too close to my sight, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, circling my campsite. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but the beam revealed nothing but empty desert. That's when I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the light. It was only there for a second, but I'm sure I saw it. A tall, thin silhouette, almost transparent in the moonlight. Then it was gone, melting into the darkness like it had never been there at all. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and on edge. I told myself it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and unfamiliar surroundings. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. The desert was beautiful in the daylight, all golden sand and blue sky. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see that ghostly figure standing there. It was late afternoon when I stumbled across the grave marker. It was just a simple wooden cross, weathered and leaning to one side, with a name carved into it, Elias Thatcher, 1843-1889. I don't know why, but seeing that lonely grave out there in the middle of nowhere sent a chill down my spine. As I stood there, staring at the marker, the wind picked up. It whistled through the canyons, carrying with it the strangest sound, like a voice calling from far away. I spun around, certain I'd see someone behind me, but there was nothing but empty desert in every direction. That night, things got even weirder. I was sitting by my campfire when the flames suddenly flared up, reaching impossibly high into the sky. The heat was intense, forcing me to scramble backward, and in those flames, I swear I saw a face, gaunt and hollow-eyed, mouth open in a silent scream. I blinked, and the fire was normal again, crackling quietly in the ring of stones, but the image of that face was burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to the grave I'd found earlier. Sleep was out of the question. I sat up all night, jumping at every sound, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. The footsteps came again, closer this time, and with them a cold that seemed to seep into my very bones, despite the warmth of the desert night. Just before dawn, I saw the figure again. It was standing at the edge of my campsite, more solid this time. I could make out the shape of a man, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. He was looking right at me, and the sorrow in his eyes was overwhelming. I don't know what made me do it, but I spoke to him. "Elias," I said, my voice shaking. "Elias Thatcher?" The figure nodded, just once, and then began to fade away. But before he disappeared completely, I heard a whisper on the wind, "Remember me." When the sun came up, I packed up my camp in a daze. I knew I should leave, get as far away from this place as possible. But something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that Elias, or whatever that thing was, needed something from me. I hiked back to the grave marker, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. When I got there, I noticed something I'd missed before, a small pile of stones at the base of the cross. It looked like an offering of some kind. Without really knowing why, I added my own stone to the pile. As I did, I spoke aloud, telling Elias's story as best I could piece it together. I talked about the hardships he must have faced as a pioneer in this unforgiving land, about the life he might have led, and the circumstances that could have led to his lonely grave out here in the desert. As I spoke, the air around me seemed to change. The oppressive feeling that had been following me lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. When I finished, I could have sworn I felt a hand on my shoulder, just for a moment, and then it was gone. I left Anza Borrego that day, but the experience has stayed with me. I can't explain what happened out there, whether it was all in my head or if I really encountered the spirit of a long-dead pioneer, but I do know that something changed in me during those few days in the desert. I found myself researching the history of Anza Borrego, learning about the people who lived and died there long before it became a state park. And every time I read about another forgotten soul from the past, I think about Elias, and I wonder how many other spirits are out there, waiting for someone to remember them. I went to the desert looking for solitude and a chance to heal from my divorce. Instead, I found a connection to something much bigger than myself. The desert, I've learned, is not just an empty wasteland. It's a place full of stories, of lives lived and lost, of secrets buried in the sand. Sometimes late at night, I still hear those footsteps, but they don't scare me anymore. Instead, they remind me that we're all part of a larger story, one that stretches back further than we can imagine. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we get a glimpse of that bigger picture, a chance to bridge the gap between past and present, between the living and the dead. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened to me in Anza Borrego, but I do know that it changed me, opened my eyes to a world beyond what we can see and touch. And for that, I'll always be grateful to Elias Thatcher, the ghostly pioneer who taught me that even in the emptiest of places, we're never truly alone. The first day started off normally enough. We hiked up to our campsite, joking and chatting along the way. The scenery was breathtaking, towering pines, craggy rock formations, glimpses of snow-capped peaks in the distance. But as we set up camp that evening, I started to get an uneasy feeling. It was too quiet. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing. Just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off as we sat around the campfire that night. Jordan broke out some beers, and we were all having a good time. But then our equipment started malfunctioning for no reason. Flashlights flickering on and off, cell phones losing signal despite having full bars moments before. Liam's camping stove wouldn't light no matter what we tried. We laughed it off at first, blaming it on faulty gear. But then we started hearing whispers, faint at first, like the wind through leaves, but there was no breeze. The whispers grew louder, sounding almost like words in a language I couldn't understand. Everyone went silent, straining to listen. That's when we realized they seemed to be coming from all around us. Kelsey let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, guys, very funny. You can stop now." But the looks on everyone's faces told me this wasn't a prank. The whispers faded away, leaving us in stunned silence. That oppressive quiet settled over us again, but now it felt malevolent, like we were being watched by something in the darkness beyond our campfire's glow. Jordan, trying to lighten the mood, pulled out a spirit board he'd brought along as a joke. "Maybe we stirred up some ghosts. Let's see if they want to chat." I wanted to tell him to put it away. Something about using it here felt wrong. But before I could object, he and Kelsey had already placed their hands on the planchette. At first, nothing happened. Then it started to move, spelling out a message: "Get out." We all jumped back. The planchette flew off the board like it had been flung by an invisible hand. That's when things got really bad. The temperature plummeted. Our breath frosted in the air as the campfire sputtered and died, plunging us into darkness. In the beam of my flickering flashlight, I saw something, a shape, more shadow than substance, moving at the edge of the trees. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Liam saw it too. "What the fuck is that?" he whispered. As if in response, an ungodly shriek split the air. It sounded like a mountain lion's scream mixed with a human wail. We all ran for the tent, huddling inside as more inhuman howls echoed through the night. None of us slept. We spent hours in terrified silence, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling leaf outside. Just before dawn, we heard footsteps circling the tent. Heavy, deliberate steps that no animal would make. Then a voice, my voice, called out from just beyond the thin fabric walls. "Guys, it's okay. You can come out now. Everything's fine." It was my voice, but I hadn't said a word. I was right there in the tent with the others. Ice ran through my veins as I realized whatever was out there could mimic us perfectly. As soon as the sun rose, we broke camp in record time and started hiking back down the mountain. We'd only gone about a mile when Jordan let out a blood-curdling scream. We turned to see him on the ground, clutching his leg. There were deep gashes in his calf, like claw marks, but they'd appeared out of nowhere. One second he was fine. The next, he was bleeding profusely. Liam and I bandaged him up as best we could while Kelsey kept watch. That's when the forest around us changed. The trees seemed to shift and warp, creating a disorientating effect. Paths that should have led downhill now sloped upwards. Landmarks we'd passed earlier reappeared, but in the wrong places. It was like the mountain itself was trying to keep us there. We pushed on, half carrying Jordan between us. The whispers returned, louder now. Sometimes they sounded like pleas for help, other times like menacing threats. Branches seemed to reach out to grab at us. Rocks rolled across our path of their own accord. Then we saw it clearly for the first time. The creature. It was horrifying, a grotesque amalgamation of human and animal features that seemed to constantly shift and change. One moment it looked almost human. The next it was more like a wolf or a bear, but always wrong, always unnatural. Its eyes glowed with an intelligence that was decidedly not animal. This thing was smart, and it was toying with us. We ran. God, we ran so hard, crashing through underbrush, slipping on rocks, gasping for breath. But no matter how fast we went, it was always right behind us. Sometimes we'd see it flitting between trees. Other times we'd just hear that awful shriek, so close it felt like it was right in our ears. I don't know how long we ran, hours probably. Everything blurred together in a nightmarish haze of terror and exhaustion. Somehow, miraculously, we made it back to our cars. We piled in and sped away, not stopping until we'd put miles between us and Mount Shasta. We never spoke about what happened to anyone else. Who would believe us? I still have nightmares about that thing. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear those whispers again. Liam and I broke up. Neither of us could look at each other without being reminded of the horror we'd experienced. Jordan's leg never fully healed. The doctors were baffled by the wounds. I don't know what that creature was. A skinwalker, a wendigo, some guardian spirit of the mountain. I've researched every possibility I can think of, but nothing quite fits. All I know is that there are things out there beyond human understanding, things that can break the laws of reality as we know them, and some places are best left alone. I'll never go back to Mount Shasta, but sometimes I wonder, did we really escape? Or did that thing just let us go, knowing it had changed us forever? I may have left the mountain, but I'm not sure the mountain ever truly left me. Woody Fire Photographer, and I've been doing this for over 15 years now. I've always loved the solitude of nature, the thrill of capturing that perfect shot. But what happened in Cimarron Canyon? It changed everything. It was supposed to be a routine trip. I'd heard about the diverse wildlife in the area, and I was excited to spend a week there, just me and my camera. I arrived at the park early in the morning, the sun just peeking over the horizon. The air was crisp, and there was a strange stillness that I initially attributed to the early hour. As I set up my RV in the designated camping area, I couldn't shake off this feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was never anyone there, just the towering trees and the distant sound of a creek. I decided to start my day with a hike, hoping to scout some good locations for photos. The trail I chose was secluded, winding deep into the forest. About an hour in, I noticed something odd. There were symbols carved into some of the trees. They looked old, weathered, but there was something unsettling about them. I snapped a few pictures, thinking they might be interesting to research later. As I continued my hike, the forest seemed to get denser, the light struggling to penetrate the canopy. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was so faint at first that I thought it was just the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a woman's voice, harsh and urgent. I spun around, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out. No response, just that eerie whisper, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I decided to head back to my RV. As I turned, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, just for a split second, standing between two distant trees. It looked like a woman, but there was something off about her. Her form seemed to shimmer like a mirage. I practically ran back to the campsite, my camera bouncing against my chest. When I got back to my RV, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just another hiker, and my imagination was running wild. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. As evening approached, I met a couple at the communal fire pit, Matt and Casey Woods. They seemed friendly enough, but when I mentioned the symbols I'd seen and the strange experience in the forest, their faces went pale. "You saw her, didn't you?" Casey whispered, her eyes wide. Matt shushed her, but I pressed for more information. Reluctantly, they told me about the local legend. Apparently, centuries ago, when settlers first came to the area, they accused a woman of witchcraft. They hunted her down in the canyon and killed her. But according to the legend, her spirit never left. She said to haunt the forest, protecting it and punishing those who disrespect the land. I laughed it off, trying to hide how shaken I was. But as I walked back to my RV that night, the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, angry. I quickened my pace, fumbling with my keys as I reached my RV. Once inside, I locked the door and tried to calm myself down. I decided to review the photos I'd taken that day, hoping it would distract me. But as I scrolled through them on my camera, my blood ran cold. In several of the shots, there was a dark, blurry figure in the background. A figure I hadn't seen when taking the pictures. I zoomed in, my hands shaking. It was the same woman-like form I'd glimpsed in the forest. But in these images, I could make out more details. She wore tattered, old-fashioned clothes, and her hair was wild and unkempt. But it was her eyes that terrified me the most. They seemed to glow with an unnatural light, staring directly at the camera. Suddenly, the lights in my RV flickered. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and then, in the window reflection, I saw her. The witch. She was inside the RV with me. I screamed and spun around, but the RV was empty. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I knew I needed to leave right then and there. I didn't care about my planned week-long stay or the photos I'd hoped to take. I just needed to get out. As I started the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, panic rising in my throat. On the fifth try, it finally roared to life. As I pulled out of the campsite, I glanced in my rearview mirror. There she was, standing in the middle of the road, her eyes glowing in the darkness. I drove through the night, not stopping until I was miles away from Cimarron Canyon. When I finally pulled over at a rest stop, exhausted and terrified, I noticed something on my arm. There, like a brand on my skin, was one of the symbols I'd seen carved into the trees. It's been months since that night, but the symbol hasn't faded. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. And when I look at the photos from that day, the witch is always there, watching, waiting. I don't know if anyone will believe this story. Hell, sometimes I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I experienced, what I saw. And I know I'll never set foot in Cimarron Canyon State Park again. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some spirits are better left undisturbed. My name's Eric, and I'm a travel writer. I've been to some pretty remote places, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened at Caballo Lake State Park. It was supposed to be a routine assignment. Spend a few days exploring the area, take some photos, write up a nice piece about the natural beauty and recreational opportunities. Easy stuff, right? I arrived at Percha Creek on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in late September. The campground was quiet, just a handful of RVs scattered around. I found a secluded spot near the creek to pitch my tent, thinking I'd lucked out with the peaceful location. As I was setting up camp, I noticed something red floating in the creek. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash, but when I went to fish it out, I realized it was an old-fashioned rubber ball. You know the kind, bright red, about the size of a grapefruit. It looked like it had been in the water for years, the surface all faded and scuffed. I don't know why, but something about that ball gave me the creeps. I should have just left it there, but like an idiot, I brought it back to my campsite. I told myself it would make a good prop for some photos. That night, things started to get weird. I was sitting by my campfire, working on my laptop, when it suddenly shut off. No warning, no low battery indicator, just dead. I figured maybe the battery was faulty, so I plugged it in to charge. Nothing. It wouldn't even turn on. Frustrated, I decided to call it a night. As I was zipping up my tent, I heard splashing coming from the creek. It sounded like kids playing in the water. I checked my watch. It was almost midnight. Who the hell lets their kids swim that late? I grabbed my flashlight and headed down to the water's edge, ready to give some irresponsible parents a piece of my mind. But when I got there, the creek was eerily still. No ripples, no movement, just the moonlight reflecting off the surface. That's when I heard it, a soft, lilting voice singing a lullaby. The words were indistinct, but the melody sent chills down my spine. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. "Is anyone there?" No response, just that damn lullaby, fading in and out like a badly tuned radio. I practically ran back to my tent, zipping myself in and trying to convince myself I was just tired and imagining things. But as I lay there in the dark, I could have sworn I heard the pitter-patter of small, wet feet circling my tent. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight was streaming through the tent walls, and birds were chirping. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd just had a vivid nightmare. Then I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. There, in the dirt all around my campsite, were dozens of small, wet footprints, child-sized. They led from the creek to my tent, circled it several times, then led back to the water. My heart was pounding as I followed the prints to the creek's edge. That's when I saw it, the red ball, floating in the exact same spot I'd found it yesterday. I know I'd left it by my tent last night. How the hell did it get back in the water? I spent the rest of the morning trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe some local kids were playing a prank. Maybe I was more tired than I realized and my mind was playing tricks on me. I even called the park ranger station, but they said there hadn't been any families with young children staying at the campground for weeks. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned my back, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. When I'd spin around, there'd be nothing there. My electronics kept malfunctioning. My phone would turn on and off randomly, open apps on its own, or play snippets of that creepy lullaby even when it was on silent. My camera would capture nothing but static when I tried to take pictures of the creek. By late afternoon, I was a nervous wreck. I decided to pack up and leave, assignment be damned. But as I was breaking down my tent, I heard a child's laugh right behind me. I whirled around and saw a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing at the edge of my campsite. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, soaking wet and clinging to her small frame. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, God, her eyes were pitch black, like empty sockets. "Play with us," she said, her voice echoing in a way that made my skin crawl. "We've been so lonely." I blinked, and she was gone. But now I could see other children emerging from the creek. Boys and girls, all in old-fashioned clothes, all soaking wet. They were slowly advancing towards me, their arms outstretched. "Join us, Eric," they chanted in unison. "Come play in the creek." I don't know how they knew my name, but that snapped me out of my paralysis. I grabbed my car keys and ran, leaving all my gear behind. As I sprinted towards the parking lot, I could hear them calling after me, their voices mixing with that goddamn lullaby. I made it to my car and peeled out of there, gravel flying. In my rearview mirror, I saw the group of children standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. And there, in the center of the group, was the little girl, holding that red ball. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was well out of New Mexico. It took days before I worked up the courage to call the park and ask them to ship me my abandoned gear. When it arrived, everything was bone dry, neatly packed as if I'd done it myself. And sitting on top was that red ball with a note that simply said, "Come back and play soon." I don't know what happened at Percha Creek. I've done research since then and found old newspaper articles about a school bus that went off the road and into the creek back in 1953, drowning a dozen children. But that doesn't explain what I experienced. All I know is that I still have nightmares about those kids, about their cold, wet hands reaching for me. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that lullaby calling me back to play. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon and set up our tents. The landscape was breathtaking. Rugged lava fields stretched as far as the eye could see, with jagged rock formations jutting up against the sky. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the terrain, we decided to do a quick hike to scout out the area before dark. About a mile from our camp, we came across the entrance to a lava tube. Rob, always the daredevil, wanted to check it out. I was hesitant. Something about the gaping black maw of the cave entrance made me uneasy. But Jake and Tasha were excited too, so I pushed my fears aside and followed them in. The temperature dropped as soon as we entered the tube. Our headlamps cast eerie shadows on the walls as we made our way deeper underground. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps echoing off the rock. That's when we heard it, a strange guttural sound coming from further in the cave. It wasn't quite human, but not quite animal either. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered. Jake nodded, his face pale in the beam of his headlamp. "Maybe we should head back." But before we could turn around, we saw movement in the darkness ahead. A figure emerged from the shadows, and my blood ran cold. It was humanoid in shape, but something was terribly wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it came closer, I could make out more details. Patchy fur covering parts of its body, and a face that seemed to shift between human and animal features. We stood frozen in terror as the creature cocked its head, studying us. Then it opened its mouth and spoke, in Rob's voice. "Hey guys, what's wrong? It's just me." The sound of Rob's familiar laugh coming from that thing's mouth snapped us out of our paralysis. We turned and ran, scrambling back towards the cave entrance as fast as we could. I could hear it pursuing us, its footsteps eerily silent compared to our panicked breathing and pounding feet. We burst out of the cave into the fading daylight, not daring to look back. We sprinted all the way back to our campsite, collapsing by the tents as we tried to catch our breath. "What the hell was that thing?" Tasha gasped between breaths. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here," Jake said, already starting to pack up our gear. As we hurriedly broke down the tents, I noticed Rob was oddly quiet. When I turned to look at him, my stomach dropped. He was staring off into the distance with a blank expression, not helping with the packing at all. "Rob, you okay?" I asked hesitantly. He turned to look at me, and for a split second I swear his eyes flashed yellow. Then he blinked and seemed to snap out of it. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little shaken up, I guess," he said with a weak smile. Something felt off, but I was too freaked out to dwell on it. We finished packing in record time and piled into Jake's SUV. As we drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. About an hour down the road, Rob suddenly said he wasn't feeling well and asked Jake to pull over. As soon as the car stopped, Rob jumped out and ran into the darkness beyond the headlights. "Rob, wait!" Jake called out, but there was no response. We waited for what felt like hours, calling Rob's name and searching the area with our flashlights, but he had vanished without a trace. That's when the whispering started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I clearly heard Rob's voice calling my name from the darkness. Jake and Tasha heard it too. Rob's voice seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, growing louder and more insistent. Panic set in as we realized the thing from the cave had followed us. We piled back into the car and sped off, leaving Rob behind. I still feel guilty about that, but we were terrified out of our minds. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia and fear. Every time we stopped, strange things would happen. Our phones and cameras would malfunction. We'd hear footsteps circling the car. At one point, we saw a figure dart across the road, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. By the time we made it back to civilization, we were all emotional wrecks. We went to the police, but of course they didn't believe our story about a shape-shifting creature. They just filed a missing persons report for Rob. It's been 2 years, and Rob has never been found. Jake, Tasha, and I have all been in therapy, trying to process what happened. But we know what we saw. That thing in the cave wasn't human. It was ancient, predatory, and far more intelligent than any animal. I still have nightmares about yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I can hear Rob's voice whispering my name. But worst of all is the nagging fear that maybe, just maybe, the Rob that ran into the desert that night wasn't really Rob at all. I don't know if it was a skinwalker or some other kind of shapeshifter. All I know is that something evil lives in those lava tubes, and it can take on the form of the people you love. If you're ever hiking in El Maltese, be careful. And if you hear a familiar voice calling to you from the shadows, run. It all started when I decided to take a solo camping trip to Hyde Memorial State Park near Santa Fe. I was going through a really rough patch after losing my sister Ella. We were super close, and her death hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought getting away from it all, surrounding myself with nature, might help clear my head and process my grief. Man, was I wrong. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the campground. As I set up my tent, I couldn't shake this weird feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was never anyone there. Once I got everything set up, I decided to take a quick hike before it got dark. That's when things started to get really freaky. About half a mile down the trail, I stumbled across this old, ratty-looking doll just lying in the middle of the path. It was one of those porcelain dolls with the creepy glass eyes that seem to follow you. I don't know why, but something compelled me to pick it up. As soon as I touched it, a chill ran down my spine. I quickly dropped it and hurried back to my campsite. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. The wind was howling through the trees, and I swear I could hear faint whispers carried on the breeze. At first I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I clearly heard a child's voice say, "Help us." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. I unzipped the tent and peered out, but there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I eventually managed to drift off into a fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake by the sound of children crying. It sounded like it was coming from all around me, but when I got out of the tent to investigate, the crying stopped abruptly. As the sun started to rise, I decided to pack up and get the hell out of there. But as I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something odd. About 50 yards away, partially hidden by some trees, was another campsite. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Clothes and gear were strewn about, and a half-eaten meal was still sitting on a picnic table. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. As I approached, the air around me grew cold, and that feeling of being watched intensified. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but got no response. When I reached the campsite, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, sitting on one of the chairs, was the same damn doll I'd found on the trail the day before. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. How the hell did it get here? As I turned to run back to my own campsite, I saw her, a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing at the edge of the clearing. She was pale as a ghost, with long dark hair and empty eyes. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Why didn't you protect us, Jack?" she asked. "Why didn't you save us like you couldn't save Ella?" I froze. How did she know my name? How did she know about Ella? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The girl took a step towards me, and I could see tears streaming down her face. "We're trapped here," she said. "We can't move on. We need your help." Suddenly, more children appeared behind her. Some were crying, others looked angry, but they all had the same haunted look in their eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around me felt thick and heavy, like I was underwater. The first girl reached out her hand, and I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and loss wash over me. Images flashed through my mind, children laughing, playing, then screaming in terror. I saw flashes of violence, of pain, of fear, and through it all, I kept seeing Ella's face, heard her voice calling out to me for help. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear and grief. But suddenly, a loud crack of thunder snapped me out of it. I blinked, and the children were gone. The abandoned campsite had vanished too, leaving no trace it had ever been there. I ran back to my tent, threw everything into my car, and tore out of that park like a bat out of hell. As I drove away, I could have sworn I heard children's laughter echoing through the trees. It's been months since that day, but I still can't shake what happened. I've done research, trying to find out if there's any history of missing children or tragic events at Hyde Memorial State Park, but I've come up empty. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a vivid hallucination brought on by grief and lack of sleep. But then I'll catch a glimpse of a child out of the corner of my eye, or hear a faint whisper on the wind, and I know. Those spirits, whatever they were, are still out there, and they're still waiting for someone to help them. I don't know why they chose me or what connection they have to Ella, but I can't escape the feeling that I failed them somehow, just like I failed my sister. The guilt eats away at me every day. I haven't been camping since, and I doubt I ever will again. The thought of being alone in the woods terrifies me now. But even in the safety of my own home, I can't escape the memory of those children and their pleading eyes. I'm writing this as a warning to anyone thinking of camping at Hyde Memorial State Park. Be careful, be aware. And if you hear children's voices on the wind or see a ratty old doll in the middle of the trail, turn around and get out of there as fast as you can. As for me, I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that day. I've considered going back, trying to find answers, or maybe even help those spirits find peace. But every time I think about it, fear grips me so tightly I can barely breathe. So for now, I'm left with nothing but questions and the lingering fear that one day those spirits might find me again. And next time, they might not let me go so easily. I never believed in the supernatural. As a researcher, I prided myself on my logical approach to archaeology. But what happened to me at Chaco Canyon shook me to my core and made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It was supposed to be a routine expedition to document petroglyphs in the Devil's Forks area. My mentor, Carla, had warned me to be cautious and respectful of the site, but I brushed off her concerns as superstition. How I wish I had listened. The day started normally enough. I hiked out to the remote area, my backpack loaded with camera equipment and supplies. The rugged beauty of the canyon was breathtaking, with towering sandstone cliffs and ancient ruins scattered across the landscape. As I approached the petroglyph site, I felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The air seemed to grow thicker, almost oppressive. I shrugged off the uneasy feeling and set up my equipment. As I started photographing the intricate rock carvings, I noticed something odd in my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement where there shouldn't have been any. I turned to look, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just rocks and scrub brush. Trying to focus on my work, I continued documenting the petroglyphs. But that nagging sense of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, heart racing, convinced I would see someone standing there. Again, nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. "Get it together, Caleb," I muttered to myself. "There's nothing out here." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. Something was out there. Something was stalking me. I hurriedly packed up my gear, deciding to call it a day and head back to camp. As I shouldered my backpack, a blood-curdling howl echoed through the canyon. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. My blood ran cold. I started speed-walking back the way I'd come, constantly looking over my shoulder. The terrain seemed to shift and change with each glance. Landmarks I'd passed on the way in were no longer where they should be. Panic started to set in as I realized I was lost. Fumbling for my compass, I was horrified to see the needle spinning wildly, unable to find true north. My heart pounded in my chest. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a rational explanation. That's when I saw it. Emerging from behind a massive boulder was the most terrifying creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was enormous, at least 10 feet tall, with a vaguely humanoid body covered in what looked like bark or rough hide. But its head, dear God, its head. Huge antler-like protrusions jutted out in all directions, creating a nightmarish crown. And its eyes, two glowing red orbs that pierced right through me. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to move or even breathe. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with what felt like ancient malevolence. I knew with certainty that I was being judged as a trespasser, an intruder on sacred ground. Finding my legs at last, I turned and ran blindly. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through scrub brush, my lungs burning. I could hear it behind me, not running, but moving with unnatural speed. The sound of branches snapping and rocks crunching underfoot grew closer and closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. The creature was right there, reaching for me with gnarled branch-like fingers. I let out a scream and put on an extra burst of speed. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from under my feet. I tumbled down a steep slope, my body bouncing off rocks and bushes. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and battered. Looking up, I saw the creature looming at the top of the slope, its antlers silhouetted against the sky. In that moment, a memory surfaced. The Navajo blessing Carla had insisted I learn, just in case. With trembling lips, I began to recite the words, my voice barely above a whisper. To my amazement, the creature hesitated. It took a step back, then another. As I continued the blessing, my voice growing stronger, it retreated further into the shadows. Finally, with one last baleful glare from those glowing red eyes, it vanished. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. As the sun began to set, I knew I had to find my way back to camp. Every snapping twig, every rustle of wind made me flinch. But somehow, I made it back safely. I've tried to rationalize what happened that day. Maybe it was dehydration or a bad reaction to something I ate. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, ancient forces that guard places we have no right to trespass upon. I never returned to Chaco Canyon after that day. My colleagues think I had some kind of breakdown, but I know what I saw. That creature was real, and it was protecting something far older and more powerful than any of us can comprehend. Now, when I look at petroglyphs or ancient sites, I see them with new eyes. I wonder what secrets they hold, what entities might be watching from just beyond our perception. And I never, ever forget to show proper respect to the lands I study. If you're ever in Chaco Canyon, especially near Devil's Forks, be careful, be respectful, and if you hear a howl that chills you to your very soul, run, and don't look back. Some things are better left undisturbed. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me, my brother Eli, and my best friend Claire. We'd planned it as part of my research, thinking it would be a great opportunity to immerse ourselves in the landscape that had inspired so many of the legends I was studying. God, how naive we were. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning, our backpacks loaded with supplies for a 3-day expedition. The Bisti wilderness stretched out before us, a stark and beautiful landscape of otherworldly rock formations and badlands. As we hiked deeper into the wilderness, I felt a mix of excitement and reverence. This was the land where so many of the stories I'd been researching had taken place. Everything seemed perfect at first. We set up camp in a small canyon, surrounded by towering hoodoos that cast long shadows in the fading light. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. I remember feeling so content, so at peace with the world around me. That's when things started to get weird. It began with whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind, but there was something off about it. The sounds seemed to form words, just on the edge of comprehension. I caught Eli and Claire exchanging uneasy glances, and I knew they heard it too. "Did you guys hear that?" Claire finally asked, her voice tight with tension. Eli nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond our fire. "Yeah, it's probably just the wind though, right?" I wanted to believe him, but a chill ran down my spine. The whispers didn't sound like any wind I'd ever heard. We tried to shake it off, to laugh it away, but the atmosphere had changed. The wilderness that had seemed so welcoming just hours ago now felt oppressive, almost hostile. I found myself jumping at every snap of a twig, every rustle in the brush. As we settled into our tents for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. That's when I heard it, footsteps circling our campsite. Heavy, deliberate steps that definitely didn't belong to any animal I knew. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps paused right outside my tent. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Then, in a voice that was almost, but not quite human, I heard my name. "Maya," it whispered, in a voice that was eerily similar to Eli's. "Maya, come out. I need your help." Every instinct screamed at me not to respond, not to move. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that whatever was out there wasn't my brother. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the thing outside my tent called my name again and again, its voice shifting between Eli's and Claire's with unsettling ease. Eventually the sun rose, and the horror of the night seemed to recede. But none of us had slept, and the unease lingered like a bad taste in our mouths. We agreed to cut our trip short and head back, but as we packed up camp, we realized something was very wrong. Our surroundings had changed. The landmarks we'd used to navigate were different, twisted somehow. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted overnight. We started hiking, hoping to find our way back to the trailhead, but with each step, we seemed to get more lost. That's when we saw it for the first time, a figure standing on a distant ridge, watching us. It looked human, but there was something wrong about its proportions. And the way it moved, God, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. One moment it was there, and the next it had vanished, only to reappear closer, always watching. Eli was the first to say what we were all thinking. "Guys," he whispered, his voice shaking, "I think that's a skinwalker." The word sent a jolt of terror through me. All my research, all the stories I'd studied came flooding back. A skinwalker, a shape-shifting entity from Navajo legend, known for its malevolence towards humans who intrude on its territory. And here we were, three outsiders who had unknowingly walked right into its domain. We started running then, abandoning any pretense of finding the trail and just trying to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. But no matter how fast we ran, no matter which direction we turned, it was always there, watching, waiting. As night fell again, our situation became desperate. We were lost, exhausted, and terrified. We huddled together in a small cave, too afraid to light a fire, listening to the sounds of something moving in the darkness outside. That's when it attacked. It came at us with inhuman speed and strength, its form shifting and blurring in the darkness. Eli pushed me out of the way and took the brunt of the attack. I'll never forget his scream of pain or the sight of his blood on the cave floor. Somehow we managed to fight it off and escape. The next few hours were a blur of terror and adrenaline as we stumbled through the wilderness, half carrying Eli between us. By some miracle, we found our way back to civilization, but the ordeal was far from over. Eli's wounds were deep, both physically and emotionally. He spent weeks in the hospital, and even after he was released, he was never the same. The trauma of that night haunted him, robbing him of sleep and peace of mind. Claire couldn't handle the aftermath. She moved away shortly after, cutting off all contact. I don't blame her. Sometimes I wish I could run away from the memories too. As for me, I abandoned my research. How could I continue studying legends when I'd come face to face with their terrifying reality? The skinwalker had shown us the consequences of intruding on its world, and the price was higher than any of us could have imagined. It's been over a year now, and I still don't have any answers. The skinwalker, or whatever it was, simply vanished after that night, leaving us with nothing but scars and nightmares. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear those whispers, calling my name. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this a year ago, I would have dismissed it as a campfire tale or a vivid nightmare. But I lived it. We all did. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see that figure on the ridge, watching, waiting. And I wonder, is it still out there? And more terrifyingly, is it watching me even now? It all started when I decided to take a solo RV trip to overcome my creative block. As a wildlife photographer, I'd been struggling to find inspiration lately. The forest seemed like the perfect place to reconnect with nature and hopefully reignite my passion. The first couple of days were uneventful. I hiked, took some photos, and enjoyed the solitude. But on the third day, things started to feel off. I was deep in the forest, setting up my camera to capture the morning light, when I noticed something strange carved into a nearby tree. It looked like some kind of symbol, a circle with intricate lines inside. I brushed it off as graffiti, but as I continued my hike, I saw more of these symbols. They were everywhere once I started looking. That night, as I was editing photos in my RV, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it sounded like whispers, faint, barely audible, but definitely there. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, seeming to come from just outside my window. When I finally worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there. The next morning, I decided to explore a different area of the forest. That's when I stumbled upon the cabin. It was old, clearly abandoned for years. Something about it drew me in, despite my better judgment. Inside, it was like stepping into another world. The walls were covered in those same symbols I'd seen on the trees. There were jars filled with unidentifiable objects, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, and a large, ornate mirror that seemed out of place in the otherwise rustic setting. As I was examining the mirror, I saw a movement reflected in it, a hooded figure standing in the doorway behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart was racing as I rushed out of the cabin, determined to get back to my RV and leave this place. But the forest had other plans. On my way back, I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. I started running, panic taking over. That's when I saw it again, the hooded figure, always just at the edge of my vision. Every time I turned to look directly at it, it vanished. When I finally reached my RV, I was gasping for breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. But when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The battery was dead. My phone wouldn't turn on either. I was trapped. As night fell, the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to be coming from everywhere. The trees, the ground, even inside my own head. I huddled in my RV, too terrified to sleep. The symbols I'd seen began to glow faintly in the darkness, visible through the windows. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. It felt like hours, maybe days. Time seemed to lose all meaning. At some point, I must have passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the windows. The oppressive atmosphere from the night before had lifted, but I could still feel a lingering presence. To my surprise, the RV started without any issues. I didn't waste any time. I got out of there as fast as I could. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Ever since that trip, I've been different. The whispers still come sometimes, usually when I'm alone or in the dark. I see symbols similar to the ones in the forest out of the corner of my eye, but when I look directly at them, they're gone. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was just stress or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I know it was real. Something in that forest wanted me, and I'm terrified that one day it might find me again. I haven't picked up my camera since that trip. The thought of going back into any forest makes my skin crawl. I keep telling myself that it's over, that I'm safe now. But every time I hear a whisper or see a shadow move, I'm right back in Gila National Forest, running from something I can't explain. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has experienced something similar, that I'm not going crazy, or maybe I just need to get it out to make it feel more real and less like a nightmare. All I know is that my experience in Gila National Forest changed me forever. And sometimes, late at night, when the whispers start up again, I can't help but wonder, did I ever really leave that forest at all? My name's Daniel, and I'm a freelance writer always on the hunt for my next big story. When I heard rumors about lost Spanish gold hidden in the remote Oregon wilderness, I knew I had to check it out. Local legends, unexplored terrain, the promise of adventure. It was everything I look for in a good article. I packed up my gear and hit the road, driving out to a tiny town nestled in the foothills. The locals were friendly enough, but I could sense their unease when I brought up the gold. Most just shrugged it off as old wives' tales, but a few gave me wary looks and changed the subject. Undeterred, I headed into the mountains the next morning. The hicksing was tough, but the scenery was breathtaking. Towering pines, jagged cliffs, crystal-clear streams. As the day wore on, though, I started to feel off, like I was being watched. I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The birds and insects fell silent. Even the wind seemed to die down. Just as I was thinking about turning back, I stumbled upon a small clearing, and there, half hidden by undergrowth, was an ancient stone altar. My heart started racing as I approached it. The altar was carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. Offerings of dried flowers and small animal bones were scattered around its base. I snapped some photos, my mind already composing the article. This was exactly the kind of mystery I'd been hoping to uncover. As I circled the altar, a glint of metal caught my eye. Brushing away some leaves, I found an old gold coin. That's when I heard it. A child's laugh, high and clear. I spun around, but the clearing was empty. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I pocketed the coin and decided to make camp nearby. As night fell, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. I kept seeing flashes of movement in the darkness beyond my campfire. And then I heard it again, children's voices, whispering my name. "Daniel, Daniel." I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination running wild after a long day. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. I barely slept that night. When I finally dozed off near dawn, I had vivid nightmares of ghostly children with hollow eyes, reaching for me with skeletal hands. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. To my horror, I saw small handprints in the dirt all around my tent. My backpack had been opened, its contents strewn about. The gold coin was gone. Thoroughly freaked out, I packed up camp and practically ran down the mountain. I needed answers. Back in town, I stopped at a local diner to regroup. As I nursed a coffee with shaking hands, an older woman approached my table. She introduced herself as Maria Ortega and said she'd overheard me asking about the lost gold. "You've stirred up trouble," she said gravely. "Those mountains are sacred ground. The spirits there don't take kindly to treasure hunters." I tried to brush it off, but Maria was insistent. She told me about a dark chapter in the area's history, how Spanish conquistadors had enslaved local children to mine for gold. When the mine collapsed, killing the children, the conquistadors buried the gold and fled. "Their spirits still guard the treasure," Maria said. "They appear as children, but they're ancient and angry. They punish anyone who tries to take what's theirs." I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't. Maria must have sensed my fear. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. "A map," she whispered. "It shows the location of the old mine. But be warned, great danger awaits those who seek it out." I should have left right then, should have driven straight home and forgotten the whole thing. But the writer in me, the part that always craved a good story, couldn't let it go. I had to know the truth. Using Maria's map, I hiked back into the mountains the next day. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by phantom whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I found the old mine entrance easily enough, a gaping black maw in the mountainside, half hidden by vegetation. The air grew colder as I approached. I flicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The tunnel walls were etched with more of those strange symbols. My light caught a glint of gold up ahead, and my heart leapt. But as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't gold at all. It was a child's skull, its empty eye sockets seeming to stare right at me. That's when the whispering started again, louder this time. "Daniel, Daniel, why are you here, Daniel?" I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and there they were, a dozen ghostly children, their translucent forms flickering in and out of view. Their eyes were black pits, their mouths twisted in silent screams. I ran. Oh God, I ran so fast. But they were everywhere, appearing in front of me, beside me, reaching out with spectral hands that passed right through my body, leaving icy trails in their wake. I burst out of the cave, gasping for air. But the spirits followed. They swirled around me like a tornado, their voices rising to a deafening shriek. "Thief! Defiler! You don't belong here!" Images flashed through my mind, visions of the children's final moments, trapped in the collapsing mine. I felt their terror, their pain, their rage at being forgotten. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the onslaught. "I'm sorry," I screamed. "I didn't know. I'll leave, I promise." And just like that, it stopped. The spirits vanished. The oppressive silence lifted. I was alone on the mountainside, shaking and sobbing. I don't remember much about my trip back down the mountain or the long drive home. It's all a blur. But I know I'll never forget those children's faces or the weight of centuries of pain and anger they carried. I've tried to research what happened to me, to make sense of it all. But there are some things that defy explanation, some mysteries that are best left unsolved. I still have nightmares, still wake up some nights to the sound of phantom whispers. And sometimes, when I least expect it, I catch a glimpse of a child's face in a mirror or a window, watching me with those hollow eyes. I don't know if what I experienced was real or some kind of shared hallucination brought on by local legends and my own overactive imagination. But I do know this. There are forces in this world beyond our understanding, and some treasures are meant to stay buried, guarded by those who have paid the ultimate price. If you're ever in the Oregon mountains and you hear children's laughter on the wind, turn back. Don't make the same mistake I did. Some stories aren't worth the cost of uncovering them. My name's Emma, and I'm a grad student in geology. Last summer, I decided to do my thesis research at El Malpais National Monument in New Mexico. It's this incredible place with ancient lava flows, volcanic cinder cones, and these massive underground lava tubes. I was so excited to study the unique geological formations there. I convinced my boyfriend Mike to come along. He's always up for an adventure. We also hired a local guide named Jake, who knew the area well. The plan was to spend a week camping and exploring the monument, collecting samples and data for my research. The first couple days were amazing. The landscape was otherworldly, all black volcanic rock and twisted juniper trees. We hiked across lava fields that looked like frozen waves of obsidian. Jake showed us some of the lava tube cave systems, which were incredible. But on the third night, things started to get weird. We were sitting around the campfire after a long day of hiking when all of our phones and equipment suddenly died at the exact same time. At first, we thought it was just a bizarre coincidence. Jake said sometimes the volcanic rock could interfere with electronics. We didn't think much of it and turned in for the night. I woke up in the middle of the night to this faint whispering sound. It was barely audible, but something about it made my skin crawl. I poked my head out of the tent, thinking maybe it was just the wind, but the air was completely still. The whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I woke Mike up, but by the time he was alert, the sound had faded away. He thought I was just having a weird dream. The next morning, we packed up camp and headed deeper into the monument to explore some more remote areas. That's when things really started to go south. We kept getting turned around, even though Jake swore he knew exactly where we were going. The landscape seemed to shift and change around us in impossible ways. Landmarks we had passed would suddenly reappear, but in completely different locations. It was like the entire place was alive somehow, actively trying to disorient us. Jake was visibly shaken. He kept muttering about how this had never happened before, how he knew this area like the back of his hand. Mike tried to pull up the GPS on his phone, but of course it was still dead. We decided to head back the way we came, but nothing looked familiar anymore. As the sun started to set, panic began to set in. We were lost in this maze of volcanic rock with no working navigation tools. That's when we saw it for the first time, this dark, shadowy figure in the distance. At first I thought it was just a weird rock formation, but then it moved. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but something about its proportions was off, wrong somehow. We all froze, staring at this thing. It stood completely still for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Then it just melted away into the shadows. We were all freaked out, but tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the fading light, or our eyes playing tricks on us because we were tired and stressed. We decided to make camp for the night, hoping things would look clearer in the morning. That night, the whispering came back, louder this time. It sounded almost like chanting in some language I couldn't understand. Mike and Jake heard it too. We huddled together in one tent, too scared to sleep. Just before dawn, there was a loud, inhuman shriek from somewhere nearby. We scrambled out of the tent to see what it was. In the pre-dawn light, we saw that dark figure again, but this time it was closer, much closer, and it was changing, shifting its form in ways that shouldn't be possible. One second it looked like a person, the next like some kind of animal, then something completely alien. Jake completely lost it. He started screaming about how we had angered the spirits of the land, how we needed to get out immediately. He took off running into the darkness. Mike yelled for him to come back, but Jake was already gone. We heard his screams echo for a few seconds, then abrupt silence. Mike and I were paralyzed with fear. We knew we couldn't stay there, but we had no idea which way to go. As the sun rose, we picked a direction and started walking, hoping to find our way out or run into a park ranger. We walked for hours in silence, jumping at every little sound. Around midday, Mike said he needed to stop for a bathroom break. He walked a little ways away behind some rocks. I heard him call out to me, sounding confused. When I went to check on him, he was gone, just vanished into thin air. I searched frantically, calling his name over and over, but there was no trace of him. I don't know how long I wandered alone after that. Hours, days, time seemed to lose all meaning. I was delirious from dehydration and terror. That whispering was constant now, all around me. I kept seeing flashes of that shape-shifting thing out of the corner of my eye. Eventually, I stumbled onto a road and was picked up by a passing car. I was hospitalized for severe dehydration and exhaustion. When I was coherent enough, I tried to tell the police what had happened. They searched the area but found no sign of Mike or Jake. They clearly thought I was crazy or on drugs or something. It's been months now, and there's still no trace of them. I've given up trying to convince anyone of what really happened out there, but I know what I saw. Something evil lives in that place, something beyond our understanding. I still hear those whispers sometimes, especially at night, and I know that thing is still out there, waiting. I don't know why I survived when the others didn't, but I'll never forget what happened in El Malpais. That place changed me forever. If you ever find yourself there, be careful. And if you hear whispering on the wind, run. My name's Ellie, and I'm a writer for an adventure magazine. Last summer, I was sent on assignment to the Rio Grande Gorge in New Mexico. It was supposed to be a simple piece about hidden camping spots, you know? The kind of article that gets people excited about exploring off the beaten path. But what happened to me out there, it wasn't simple, it wasn't normal, and I'm still not sure I can explain it. I arrived at the gorge on a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was blazing, and the heat was intense, but the view was breathtaking. The gorge stretched out before me, a massive gash in the earth that seemed to go on forever. I remember thinking how small I felt next to it, like a speck of dust on the edge of something ancient and powerful. I set up camp near the rim, planning to spend a few days exploring and taking notes. That first night was quiet, peaceful even. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind whistling through the canyon. It was the next morning when things started to feel off. I woke up early, ready to start my hike, but as I stepped out of my tent, I felt this weird sensation. It was like the air around me had thickened, become heavy with something I couldn't quite name. I shook it off, chalking it up to the altitude or dehydration. As I hiked along the rim, I kept getting this feeling like I was being watched. I'd turn around, expecting to see another hiker, but there was no one. Just the vast, empty landscape and the yawning chasm of the gorge beside me. It was around midday when I met James. He just appeared on the trail in front of me, seeming to materialize out of nowhere. He was tall, lean, with this weather-beaten face that made it hard to guess his age. When he spoke, his voice was gravelly, like he hadn't used it in a while. "You shouldn't be here," he said. No hello, no introduction. I laughed it off, told him I was working on an article. But the way he looked at me, it was like he was seeing right through me, or maybe seeing something I couldn't. "The gorge doesn't like visitors," he said. "It has its own way of dealing with them." I thought he was just some local trying to scare me off, maybe protect his secret camping spots. I thanked him for the warning and kept going. God, I wish I'd listened. As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched intensified. I'd hear whispers on the wind, snippets of conversation that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. I tried to focus on my work, on taking notes and photos, but it was getting harder to concentrate. The gorge seemed to loom larger with each passing hour, its presence oppressive and somehow alive. That night, things got worse. I couldn't sleep. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood their meaning. They were calling me, trying to lure me out of my tent into the darkness. I zipped myself in tight, trying to block it out, but then I heard footsteps circling my tent. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched on the gravel outside. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent flap. I could see a shadow, huge and misshapen, cast against the fabric. It stood there, perfectly still, for what felt like hours. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. When morning finally came, I packed up as fast as I could. I decided to cut my trip short, head back to civilization. But as I started down the trail, I realized something was wrong. The path I'd taken to get here, it wasn't there anymore. I tried another direction, then another, but each time I'd find myself back where I started. Panic started to set in. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but there was no signal. The battery, which had been full the night before, was suddenly almost dead. I spent hours trying to find my way out, but it was like the landscape itself was shifting around me. Landmarks I swore I'd passed before would appear in different places. Paths would lead me in circles. And all the while, that feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew stronger. As the sun began to set, I realized I was going to have to spend another night out here. I found a small clearing and set up camp with shaking hands. That's when I saw James again. He appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face grim. "I told you," he said. "The gorge has its own way." I begged him to help me, to show me the way out. He just shook his head. "There's no way out," he said. "Not until it's done with you." Before I could ask what he meant, he was gone. Just gone. Like he'd never been there at all. That night was the worst of my life. The whispers turned into screams. The ground beneath my tent seemed to pulse and move. I saw shapes in the darkness, twisted, impossible shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. I don't know when I passed out, but I woke up the next morning to find my tent shredded, my supplies scattered, and there, carved into a nearby rock, was a message. "The gorge keeps what it claims." I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and suddenly, miraculously, I found myself at the parking lot where I'd left my car. I didn't question it. I just got in and drove, not stopping until I was miles away. It's been months now, and I still can't explain what happened to me out there. I've tried to go back, to find some rational explanation, but every time I get close to the gorge, that feeling returns. The whispers start, and I know, deep in my bones, that if I go back, I might not come out again. I don't write about hidden camping spots anymore. I can't, because now I know that some places are hidden for a reason. Some places don't want to be found. And the Rio Grande Gorge? It's more than just a canyon. It's something alive, something ancient and powerful. And it's hungry. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I experienced, and I know that out there, in that vast, beautiful, terrifying landscape, something is waiting, watching, and if you're not careful, it might just decide to keep you. My name is Lila, and I'm a wildlife biologist. I've always been fascinated by nature, spending countless hours observing animals in their habitats. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the Carson National Forest. It was supposed to be a routine research trip. My boyfriend Dan and I had been planning it for months, excited to study the elk population in Valle Vidal. We hired a local guide, Maya Torres, who knew the area like the back of her hand. The day started like any other. We packed our gear, double-checked our supplies, and set off into the wilderness. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I remember feeling so alive, so in tune with nature. If only I knew what was waiting for us. As we hiked deeper into the forest, Maya started telling us about local legends. She mentioned skinwalkers, shape-shifting entities from Navajo folklore. I brushed it off as superstition, but there was something in Maya's eyes that made me uneasy. She wasn't just reciting stories, she believed them. "We must be respectful," Maya warned. "There are forces here older than time itself." I nodded politely, but inside, I was skeptical. I was a scientist, after all. I dealt in facts, not myths. As the day wore on, things started to feel off. The forest, usually teeming with life, grew unnaturally quiet. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just an eerie silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. Dan noticed it too. "Is it always this quiet?" he asked Maya. She shook her head, her eyes darting nervously around the trees. "No, it's not. We should move quickly." We picked up our pace, the silence growing more oppressive with each step. That's when I saw the footprints. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Not quite human, not quite animal. They appeared and disappeared at random, as if whatever made them could walk through solid matter. My heart started racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. But I tried to rationalize it, desperately clinging to logic in the face of the inexplicable. As night fell, we set up camp in a small clearing. The silence had given way to strange, distant noises, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We huddled around the campfire, Maya muttering prayers under her breath. That's when we heard it, a voice calling out from the darkness. It sounded exactly like Dan, but Dan was sitting right next to me, his face pale with fear. "Hello?" the voice called again. "Can anyone help me?" Maya grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't answer it," she hissed. "That's not your friend. It's mimicking him." I felt sick to my stomach. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of trick, a prank maybe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The voice kept calling, moving around our camp. Sometimes it sounded like Dan, other times like Maya, or even me. It was toying with us, trying to lure us out into the darkness. We stayed huddled together, too terrified to sleep. As the night wore on, I caught glimpses of something moving just beyond the firelight, a shape that seemed to shift and change, never quite settling on a single form. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, we packed up camp and started moving. We had to get out of there, to find help, to make sense of what was happening. But the entity wasn't done with us. As we hiked, the whispering returned, louder now. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. And then, in a moment I'll never forget, I saw it. It stepped out from behind a tree, looking exactly like Dan, but its eyes were all wrong, black and empty, like looking into the void itself. Real Dan stumbled backward, letting out a strangled cry. Maya started chanting something in a language I didn't understand. And me? I was frozen, unable to move, unable to think. The thing that looked like Dan smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Its mouth opened wider than humanly possible, revealing row after row of sharp teeth. What happened next is a blur. There was screaming, running, the sound of something inhuman howling with glee. I remember Maya pulling me along, yelling at me to run faster. But Dan Dan wasn't with us. I turned back, just for a second, and saw the thing dragging Dan into the shadows. His eyes met mine, filled with terror and confusion. And then they were gone. We ran for what felt like hours, stumbling through the forest until we finally reached the ranger station. The search parties found no trace of Dan, no body, no belongings, nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The official report says Dan got lost in the woods, that he probably fell into a ravine or was attacked by an animal. But I know the truth. I saw what took him. I can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see that thing wearing Dan's face. I hear its voice calling out to me in the darkness. The authorities think I'm crazy, traumatized by the loss of my boyfriend. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am crazy. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there, hiding in the shadows of Valle Vidal, and I'll never be able to forget it. So here I am, sharing my story with strangers on the internet. Not because I expect you to believe me, but because I need someone, anyone, to listen. To understand that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that defy explanation. I used to believe in a rational, explainable world. Now I'm not sure what I believe anymore. All I know is that something is out there, something ancient and malevolent, and it's still out there, waiting. If you ever find yourself in Valle Vidal, be careful. Listen to the locals. Respect the land. And if you hear a familiar voice calling out to you in the darkness, run. Run and don't look back, because it might not be who you think it is. As for me, I don't know how to move on from this. How do you explain to people that your boyfriend was taken by a shape-shifting monster? How do you go back to a normal life after seeing the impossible? I'm writing this as a warning, I suppose, a plea for caution, because the world is stranger and more dangerous than we can imagine. And sometimes the monsters from our nightmares are all too real. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what happened in Valle Vidal. The nightmares, the constant fear, the feeling that I'm being watched, they're all part of my life now. But maybe, just maybe, by sharing my story, I can prevent someone else from experiencing the same horror. So please, be careful out there. And if you ever hear whispers in the forest or see footprints that shouldn't exist, don't ignore them. Don't try to rationalize them away like I did, because by the time you realize the danger, it might already be too late. That's why I decided to take a solo trip to Cibola National Forest. I thought maybe a change of scenery and some time alone in nature would help me process my grief and find inspiration again. I packed up my art supplies, some camping gear, and hit the road. When I arrived at the forest, I was immediately struck by its beauty. The towering pines, the crisp mountain air, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. It was exactly what I needed. I found a secluded spot to set up camp, eager to start painting and hopefully start healing. The first day went well. I hiked, sketched, and even managed to start a small landscape painting. As the sun began to set, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. I went to bed that night feeling hopeful for the first time in a long time. But things changed when darkness fell. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange whispering sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it sounded almost human. I couldn't make out any words, but the whispers seemed to be coming from just outside my tent. My heart started racing, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that I'd been experiencing ever since Aaron died. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard footsteps circling my tent, slow, deliberate steps that didn't sound quite right. They were too quiet, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was trying not to be heard. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or call out. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, occasionally stopping right outside my tent before moving on again. Eventually, as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the sounds faded away. When morning came, I was exhausted and on edge. I told myself I was just stressed, and that lack of sleep had made me imagine things. I decided to focus on my art, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I set up my easel near a beautiful clearing, I noticed something odd. The forest seemed quieter than it had the day before. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake off the feeling and started painting. But as I worked, I kept getting the sensation that someone was watching me. Every time I looked up from my canvas, I expected to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing. But there was never anyone there. As the day wore on, things got stranger. My phone, which I'd brought to listen to music while I painted, started acting up. It would turn on and off by itself, and sometimes I'd hear fragments of voices coming through the speakers, even though I didn't have any signal out here. The weirdest thing, though, was my painting. I'd started working on a landscape, but as the day progressed, I realized the scene on my canvas was changing. Dark shadows were creeping in at the edges, and the peaceful forest I'd intended to paint was transforming into something more sinister. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if my brush was moving on its own, guided by some unseen force. As the sun began to set, I decided to head back to my campsite. That's when I saw it for the first time. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a dark figure moving between the trees. It was tall and unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body, and it was fast, so fast that when I turned to look directly at it, it had already vanished. My heart was pounding as I practically ran back to my tent. I told myself I was just tired, that the stress and grief were making me see things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night was even worse than the first. The whispering returned, louder this time. I could almost make out words, but they were in a language I didn't understand. The footsteps were back too, circling my tent relentlessly. But the worst part was the shadows. As I lay there, paralyzed with fear, I saw dark shapes moving across the walls of my tent. They weren't cast by anything outside. They seemed to be forming and shifting right on the fabric itself. And one of them looked just like Aaron. I must have passed out at some point because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I was drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. I decided then and there that I needed to leave. This trip was supposed to help me heal, but instead, it was turning into a nightmare. As I started packing up my things, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt around my tent, but they weren't human. They were long and narrow, with too many toes, and they seemed to shimmer slightly in the morning light. I threw everything into my car as quickly as I could, not even bothering to properly pack my camping gear. As I was about to get in the driver's seat, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks. It was Aaron's voice, calling my name from somewhere in the forest. For a moment, I hesitated. It sounded so real, so much like him. But then I remembered the shadows, the whispers, the strange footprints. Whatever was out there, it wasn't Aaron. I got in my car and started driving, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. As I sped down the forest road, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that dark figure chasing after me. And then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the road, just visible in my mirror, was the shadow walker. It was even more terrifying in the daylight. A tall, impossibly thin figure that seemed to be made of pure darkness. As I watched, it raised one long, spindly arm and waved at me, almost as if it was saying goodbye. I floored the accelerator and didn't slow down until I was miles away from the forest. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'll catch a glimpse of a tall, dark figure. And at night, I still hear those whispers. I don't know what happened to me in Cibola National Forest. I don't know if it was some kind of supernatural entity, or if my grief had finally caused me to lose touch with reality. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back there again. And I'll always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when the shadow walker decides it's not done with me yet. My name is Evan Cross, and I'm a 29-year-old travel vlogger. I used to be a journalist, but the allure of adventure and the freedom to explore called to me. I've always been drawn to mysteries and legends, so when I heard about the Padres treasure supposedly hidden in the Desert Peaks National Monument, I knew I had to check it out. I packed my gear, loaded up my van, and headed out to the mountains. The drive was long, but the anticipation kept me going. As I approached the area, the landscape changed dramatically. Rugged peaks rose up around me, their jagged silhouettes stark against the sky. The desert stretched out as far as the eye could see, a sea of sand and rock. I set up camp at the base of one of the mountains, planning to start my search the next day. That night, as I sat by my campfire, I felt a strange uneasiness creep over me. It was like someone was watching me, but when I looked around, there was nothing but darkness beyond the circle of firelight. The next morning, I woke up early and started hiking up the mountain. I had done my research and had a general idea of where the treasure might be hidden. As I climbed higher, the air grew thinner and the terrain became more treacherous. I carefully picked my way across loose scree and narrow ledges. It was around midday when I stumbled upon the cave. I almost missed it. It was hidden behind an outcropping of rock, the entrance partially obscured by scrub brush. But something caught my eye, a glint of light reflecting off something inside. Curious, I pushed aside the branches and peered in. The cave opening was small, barely big enough for me to squeeze through. I turned on my headlamp and crawled inside. As I stood up in the larger chamber beyond, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool air. The walls of the cave were covered in strange symbols and drawings. They looked ancient, but somehow felt alive. As my light played across them, I could have sworn I saw them move, just at the edge of my vision. But when I looked directly at them, they were still. I moved deeper into the cave, my excitement growing. Could this be it? The hiding place of the Padres' treasure? But as I went further in, that feeling of being watched intensified. I kept hearing whispers just on the edge of hearing, voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. Suddenly my light flickered and went out. I was plunged into total darkness. Panic gripped me as I fumbled for my backup flashlight. In those few seconds of darkness, I felt something brush past me, cold and insubstantial. When I finally got my light on, I saw a figure at the far end of the chamber. It was transparent, glowing faintly in the darkness. A man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face gaunt and eyes hollow. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked through the solid rock wall. I stood there, frozen in shock and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Ghosts weren't real, but I couldn't deny what I had seen. As I stood there, trying to process what had happened, I noticed something on the ground where the figure had been standing. I walked over, my legs shaking, and picked it up. It was an old, tarnished gold coin. That's when I heard the whispers again, louder this time. They seemed to be coming from deeper in the cave. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The passage narrowed, and I had to crouch down to continue. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I emerged into another chamber, larger than the first, and there, in the center, was a pile of gold coins and jewels, the Padre's treasure right in front of me. But before I could take a step towards it, the whispers exploded into a cacophony of voices. The air around me seemed to thicken, and I felt an overwhelming sense of malevolence. Ghostly figures began to appear all around the chamber, men and women from different time periods, all with the same hollow eyes and gaunt faces. They moved towards me, their mouths open in silent screams. I turned to run, but the passage I had come through was gone, replaced by solid rock. I was trapped, surrounded by these spirits. They pressed closer, their cold presence suffocating me. I could feel their anger, their possessiveness over the treasure. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that if I touched even a single coin, I would join their ranks forever. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. But then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The voices fell silent, and when I opened my eyes, the ghosts were gone. The treasure was gone too, as if it had never been there. I was alone in an empty cave. I don't remember how I got out of that cave. My next clear memory is of stumbling into my campsite, my clothes torn and dirty, my body covered in scratches. I packed up as quickly as I could and drove away, not stopping until I was far from those mountains. I thought that was the end of it, that I could put it behind me and move on. But a week later, a package arrived at my home. Inside was an old leather-bound journal and a single gold nugget. The journal belonged to one of the spirits I had seen, detailing his own ill-fated expedition to find the treasure. The last entry warned against the curse that guarded it, the same curse that had nearly claimed me. I don't know how they found me or how they sent this package, but the message was clear. The treasure was not meant to be found. The spirits would continue to guard it, keeping it safe from those who would disturb their eternal rest. I've given up treasure hunting. My experiences in that cave have completely changed my understanding of the world. There are forces out there, supernatural and powerful, that we can't begin to comprehend, and some secrets are meant to stay buried. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers, a reminder of how close I came to becoming one of them, a warning to others who might be tempted by the lure of hidden treasure. Take it from me, some legends are better left as just that, legends. It was about 6 months after my divorce was finalized. I was in a really dark place, struggling to adjust to life on my own after 12 years of marriage. I needed to get away from everything and everyone, so I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd always loved the outdoors, and I figured some time alone in nature might help clear my head. I chose Pecos River State Park because it was remote and not very popular. I wanted solitude. And that's exactly what I got when I arrived at the campground on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. There wasn't another soul in sight. I set up my tent in a secluded spot near the river and settled in for what I hoped would be a peaceful few days of hiking and reflection. The first day and night were uneventful. I hiked some of the easier trails near the campground, cooked my meals over a small fire, and turned in early. But on the second day, everything changed. I woke up early, determined to tackle one of the more challenging trails in the park. As I was packing my day pack, I noticed a weathered wooden sign at the trailhead that I hadn't seen before. It read, "Devil's Hollow, 3 miles." Something about the name sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. I was here to challenge myself after all. The trail started off normal enough, winding through dense pine forest. But as I got deeper into the hollow, things started to feel off. The air grew thick and heavy, almost oppressive. The birdsong and insect buzzing that had filled the air earlier faded away, leaving an eerie silence. I tried to shake off my growing unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. About 2 miles in, I came to a small clearing. That's when I saw him. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing alone in the middle of the clearing. He was pale and thin, with dark circles under his eyes. My heart started racing. What was a kid doing out here alone? "Hey there," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The boy just stared at me blankly for a moment before speaking in a voice that sounded much older than his years. "I'm not lost. I live here. You shouldn't have come to this place, mister. It's not safe." Before I could respond, the boy turned and ran into the trees. I called after him, but he vanished like he'd never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to turn back, but I couldn't leave a kid alone out here. I had to find him and make sure he was okay. I pushed deeper into the hollow, calling out for the boy. The further I went, the darker and more oppressive the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I started to hear whispers on the wind, fragments of conversations I couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, I emerged into another small clearing. My blood ran cold. Standing in the center was me, an exact copy, down to the clothes I was wearing. But its eyes were completely black, empty and soulless. It smiled at me, a twisted parody of my own face. "Welcome home, Ethan," it said in my voice. "We've been waiting for you." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. I must be hallucinating or having some kind of mental breakdown. I turned to run, but the trees had closed in behind me, forming an impenetrable wall. The thing that looked like me started to change, its form rippling and shifting. Suddenly, I was face to face with my ex-wife, Jessica. But it wasn't really her. Her eyes were those same empty black voids. "Why did you leave me, Ethan?" it asked in Jessica's voice, thick with emotion. "Wasn't I good enough for you? Didn't you love me?" I covered my ears, trying to block out its words. "You're not real," I muttered. "None of this is real." But the entity wasn't done. It kept shifting, taking on the forms of people from my past, my parents, old friends, colleagues. Each one hurled accusations and painful memories at me. I saw flashes of arguments with Jessica, the pain in her eyes when I told her I wanted a divorce. I relived the moment I walked out of our house for the last time, leaving behind the life we'd built together. I don't know how long this went on. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that hellish place. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making, forced to confront every mistake and regret of my life. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take any more, I remembered something my therapist had told me. "Your thoughts don't control you. you control your thoughts. I focused all my energy on that idea, repeating it like a mantra. Slowly, the visions began to fade. The accusing voices grew quieter. I opened my eyes to find myself alone in the clearing once more. The oppressive atmosphere was lifting, and I could hear birdsong in the distance. I didn't wait around to see if the entity would return. I ran as fast as I could back down the trail, not stopping until I reached my campsite. I threw my gear into my car and peeled out of there, driving for hours until I felt safe enough to stop. It's been months since that day in Devil's Hollow, and I still can't explain what happened. Was it all in my head? Some kind of mass hallucination brought on by stress and isolation? Or was there really something supernatural at work in that forest? I don't have any answers, but I know one thing for certain. I'll never set foot in Pecos River State Park again. Whatever lives in Devil's Hollow, it's better left alone. I still have nightmares about that day, about the things I saw and heard. But in a strange way, the experience also helped me. Facing those painful memories and confronting my regrets, it forced me to deal with issues I'd been avoiding since the divorce. I'm in therapy now, working through my guilt and pain. It's not easy, but I'm making progress. Sometimes I wonder if that's what the entity in the hollow wanted all along, to force me to face my demons and start healing. Or maybe that's just me trying to find meaning in a terrifying, inexplicable experience. Either way, I'll never forget what happened in Devil's Hollow. It changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. If you ever find yourself in Pecos River State Park, do yourself a favor and stick to the main trails. Some places are better left unexplored, and some hollows deserve their devilish reputations. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. Me, my boyfriend Lucas, his best friend Jordan, and Jordan's sister Clara. We were all excited to escape the city and spend a few days hiking and stargazing in the desert. The first day was perfect. We set up camp in a secluded spot, far from the main trails. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, laughing and roasting marshmallows. If only I'd known it would be our last moment of peace. It started with whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized they sounded like words, garbled and indistinct, but definitely voices. I asked the others if they heard it too. Lucas and Clara looked confused, but Jordan's face went pale. He heard it too. We tried to brush it off, tell ourselves it was nothing, but a sense of unease had settled over our campsite. That night, I barely slept. Every rustling leaf, every creak of a branch had me on edge. I kept thinking I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just before dawn, I heard it again, the whispers. This time they were clearer, and my blood ran cold as I realized they were saying our names. When morning came, things got weirder. Half our gear was missing. Backpacks, water bottles, even Lucas's shoes. We searched everywhere, but it was like they'd vanished into thin air. Jordan was freaking out, insisting we should leave, but the rest of us thought there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe some animal had dragged our stuff off in the night. We decided to hike to the ranger station to report the theft and get some help. That's when things went from unsettling to terrifying. As we walked, I started hearing Lucas's voice calling my name from behind us, but Lucas was right next to me, silent and focused on the trail ahead. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked. They all shook their heads, looking at me like I was losing it. We pressed on, but the voices continued. Sometimes it was Lucas, sometimes Jordan or Clara. They'd call out, sounding scared or angry, but their lips weren't moving. It was like something was mimicking them, trying to lure us off the path. I was on the verge of a breakdown, questioning my own sanity. Then we saw it. A figure in the distance, just at the edge of the trees. It looked human, but wrong somehow. Its proportions were off, limbs too long and bent at unnatural angles. As we watched in horror, it began to change shape, morphing into a twisted version of Clara. It smiled at us with too many teeth, and then melted back into the shadows. Panic set in. We ran, no longer caring about finding the ranger station, just desperate to get out of the park. But it felt like we were going in circles, landmarks we'd passed before appearing again and again. The whispers grew louder, surrounding us, and the air felt thick and oppressive. As night began to fall, we realized we were hopelessly lost. We huddled together, too terrified to sleep, jumping at every sound. In the early hours of the morning, Jordan let out a blood-curdling scream. We turned to see him pointing at something in the darkness. There, just beyond the reach of our flashlights, stood a grotesque figure. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with skin that looked like it was melting off its bones. Its face was a nightmarish blend of all our features, constantly shifting and reforming. We ran again, stumbling through the dark, branches whipping our faces. I could hear it behind us, moving impossibly fast. Suddenly, Jordan tripped and fell. We turned back to help him, but he was gone. It was like the earth had swallowed him whole. Clara was hysterical, but we couldn't stop. We could hear the thing getting closer. Just when I thought we couldn't run anymore, we burst out of the trees onto a road. A car was approaching, and we flagged it down desperately. The driver, an older man, took one look at our terrified faces and ushered us in. As we sped away, I looked back at the tree line. The creature stood there, watching us go, wearing Jordan's face. We reported everything to the police, but they found no trace of Jordan or any evidence of what we'd seen. The official story is that he got lost in the park, but we know the truth. Something took him, something that defies explanation. It's been 3 months, and I still can't shake the feeling that it's out there, watching, waiting. I see its twisted face in my dreams, hear those whispers in quiet moments. Clara won't speak to us anymore. I think the guilt of losing her brother was too much. Lucas tries to be supportive, but I can see the doubt in his eyes when I talk about what happened. I don't know why that thing let us go, or why it took Jordan instead of the rest of us. All I know is that there are forces out there beyond our understanding, and they're closer than we think. If you're planning a trip to Big Bend or any remote area, be careful. And if you hear whispers in the night, run. Run and don't look back. The first couple of days were actually pretty nice. I parked my RV at a secluded campsite deep in the forest, surrounded by towering pines and oaks. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I spent my days hiking, taking notes, and enjoying the solitude. But on the third night, everything changed. I was sitting by my campfire, working on my laptop, when I heard what sounded like children laughing in the distance. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, clear as day. It was past midnight and pitch black out there. There shouldn't have been any kids around. I called out, thinking maybe some campers had wandered too far from their site. No response, just more faint giggles echoing through the trees. A chill ran down my spine. Something felt very wrong. I quickly packed up my things and went inside the RV, locking the door behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I swore I saw movement in the shadows. Flashes of pale faces peeking out from behind trees. I barely slept that night. When morning came, I decided to pack up and find a new campsite. As I was getting ready to leave, I noticed strange markings carved into the trees surrounding my campsite. They looked like crude stick figures and symbols. My blood ran cold. Those definitely hadn't been there before. I drove deeper into the forest, hoping to find a busier campground with other people around. But the further I went, the more lost I felt. The trees seemed to close in around me. My GPS stopped working, and then my RV broke down in the middle of nowhere. I tried calling for help, but there was no cell service. I was completely alone out there. As the sun began to set, panic started to set in. That's when I saw it, an old, crumbling well hidden among the trees. Something about it filled me with dread. But I was desperate for water, so I cautiously approached. As I got closer, I heard that childish laughter again. Then I saw them, ghostly figures of children, circling the well. Their eyes were dark, empty sockets. They beckoned to me, calling out in sing-song voices, "Come play with us, Laura. Come join us down in the well." I stumbled backwards in terror, my heart pounding. How did they know my name? As I turned to run, a woman's cackling laugh pierced the air. I looked back and saw her, a horrifying witch-like figure hovering over the well. Her skin was gray and decayed, her hair wild and matted. She pointed a gnarled finger at me and screamed, "You belong to us now!" I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face as I fled blindly through the darkening forest. I could hear them pursuing me, the pitter-patter of small feet, and that woman's bone-chilling laugh. Eventually, I found my way back to my broken-down RV and locked myself inside. But they surrounded the vehicle, scratching at the walls and windows. The children's faces pressed against the glass, their mouths open in silent screams. The witch woman's voice boomed all around. "You can't escape us, Laura. We'll drag you down to the well where you belong." I was paralyzed with fear, certain I was going to die. Then I remembered the lucky horseshoe hanging on my rearview mirror, an old gift from my grandmother. In desperation, I grabbed it and held it up. To my shock, the spirits recoiled from it, shrieking. I took advantage of their retreat and frantically searched my cabinets until I found some dried sage I'd brought for cooking. I lit it and started smudging the RV, waving the smoke into every corner. The entities wailed and thrashed outside, but they couldn't seem to get back in. I don't know how long I huddled there, clutching the horseshoe and smudging sage. Hours passed in a blur of terror. Finally, as dawn broke, the spirits faded away with the night. My RV miraculously started up again, and I got the hell out of there as fast as I could. I still don't understand what happened that night. Was it all just a vivid hallucination brought on by isolation? Or did I really encounter something supernatural in those woods? All I know is that I'll never go back to Sam Houston National Forest again. Those memories will haunt me for the rest of my life. Sometimes I still hear those children laughing in my dreams, calling me to join them down in the well. I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if they'll find me again someday. I keep that horseshoe with me always now. It's the only thing that makes me feel safe. I never ended up finishing my memoir. How could I focus on writing about my boring life after an experience like that? Instead, I've thrown myself into researching the history of Sam Houston National Forest, trying to make sense of what I saw. I've found vague stories about an old witch who used to live out there, luring children to their deaths, but nothing concrete. Part of me wants to go back, to investigate further and get proof of what happened, but I know that would be insane. I was lucky to escape once. I might not be so fortunate a second time, so I stay away, and I warn everyone I meet to be careful in those woods. There are things out there that can't be explained, things that want to drag you down into darkness. I still struggle with nightmares and anxiety. Loud noises make me jump. I'm terrified of the dark. Sometimes I think I see those ghostly faces watching me from shadows or reflections. I've been to therapy, but I can't bring myself to tell the full story. They'd think I was crazy, so I keep it to myself, carrying the weight of that night alone. But I needed to share it somewhere to get it off my chest. Maybe someone out there has had a similar experience and can help me make sense of it all. Or maybe this will serve as a warning to others to be careful out there in the wilderness. Not everything that goes bump in the night is just your imagination. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from what I saw in Sam Houston National Forest. Those memories are seared into my brain. But I'm trying to move forward, one day at a time. I've started volunteering at an animal shelter to keep myself busy. Being around the dogs helps calm my nerves. Still, I sleep with the lights on every night, and that horseshoe is always within reach, just in case those spirits ever come looking for me again. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe, but I'm alive, and I'm grateful for that. I just hope that sharing my story might help someone else out there who's experienced something similar. You're not alone, and you're not crazy. There are things in this world beyond our understanding. All we can do is look out for each other and stay vigilant. Be careful out there, folks, and maybe think twice before taking a solo camping trip deep in the woods. You never know what might be waiting for you in the darkness.